Good morning, everybody. So it's 9 and we'll get started in a couple minutes. I want to give it a few minutes to allow more stakeholders to show, but this is the workshop on the potential amendments to the off-road diesel fueled fleets regulation. Like I said, I'll get started in a couple minutes. Okay, I think we're safe to get started. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Carb workshop related to the potential amendments to the in-use off-road diesel fueled fleets regulation. In this meeting, we will be taking a comprehensive look at the potential amendments and discuss each potential provisions in detail. First, a couple housekeeping items. The presentation material is available in the handout section of the webinar, and it is also posted on the ARB webpage. This webinar is being recorded, and the intent is to post the recording publicly, so just a reminder that any information you share may be accessible and released to the public. And lastly, there will be a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. There will be 2 ways to participate. Attendees can either raise their hands and staff will call on you and unmute you so you can ask your question verbally, or you can type in the question area of the webinar and staff will read out your comment or question. The morning will start off with a presentation where we will discuss the comprehensive concept for the potential amendments, as well as provide some further information related to the cost analysis we've been working on, followed by a question and answer period. Then we will break for lunch at noon and come back at 1 for a presentation by our Air Quality Planning and Science Division, where we will discuss updates to the off-road inventory. If there's time at the end of the presentation and there are still questions on the amendment concept, we can field further questions at that time. Next, let's do some Carb staff introductions. My name is Nathan Dean. I work in the Heavy Duty Off-Road Strategies branch, and I'm the staff lead overseeing these potential amendments to the off-road diesel rule. Next, we'll have my manager introduce herself.
Johanna Lovine, manager of the Off-Road Implementation Section. Tess.
And Tess C. Cadnam, the branch chief.
And lastly, we'll have Russell Fury introduce himself. Potentially. Well, so Russell Fury works with our Air Quality Planning and Science Division. He'll be the presenter for the afternoon session at 1. So, okay. So we want to start off by highlighting the reason why we're developing these amendments to the off-road diesel regulation, and that is because we need to achieve additional criteria pollutant emission reductions to help reach attainment in regions with severe air quality issues, as well as protect the public from the harmful effects of air pollution. This picture shows several of our air quality targets focused around reaching attainment in South Coast and the San Joaquin Valley. In particular, there are ozone targets in 2023, 2031, and 2037 for both regions, as well as PM 2.5 targets in the 2024-25 timeframe. This slide shows that the South Coast Air Basin and the San Joaquin Valley are in extreme non-attainment for ozone, which the previous slide showed important dates on the path to reaching attainment in those regions. but it also highlights that there are many other regions in California that are in non-attainment, where reductions in NOx emissions are also vital to ensure healthy air quality is achieved for all of California. So here we wanted to focus the discussion more specifically on the off-road contribution of NOx emissions in California. 16% of all NOx emissions in California come from off-road diesel equipment. And as we'll see in the next slide, the contribution from off-road equipment is only growing in importance as the on-road sector gets cleaner. Actions are being taken to drastically reduce the NOx emissions coming from on-road equipment in California, as seen in this chart, and off-road is becoming an even more important sector that needs to achieve further emission reductions. According to projections, off-road will become the largest contributor to NOx emissions by 2022. So now that we've discussed the need for action in the off-road sector, we wanted to discuss what Carb is planning for the coming years to address this need for emission reductions and highlight that these potential amendments are only one of several actions Carb is looking at. First, Carb is looking from the incentive side of things to encourage the adoption of zero-emission small off-road engines, as well as expand the Clean Off-Road Equipment Program to provide incentives for zero-emission construction equipment that will be commercially available in the very near future. Next, we have these potential amendments to the in-use off-road diesel regulation that is looking at achieving quick and targeted near-term criteria pollutant reductions, in large part by preventing the operation of the oldest and dirtiest off-road diesel equipment that is subject to the regulation. Next, we have a zero-emission forklift regulation currently under development, followed by a potential clean off-road fleet recognition program, where fleets would be recognized for going as clean as possible with a strong emphasis on zero-emission technology. Then there's the Tier 5 off-road diesel new engine regulation under development, as well as a later action for a targeted manufacturer rule focused on the production of zero-emission off-road equipment. Again, the point of presenting our overarching off-road strategy is to highlight that these potential amendments are only one action among many that aim to clean up the off-road sector, as well as move it towards California's zero-emission future, as directed by the governor in Executive Order N7920. So here we're going to start really getting into the details in regard to the potential changes we're proposing for the off-road diesel regulation. First, I want to provide some context. The conceptual language we have developed is not final regulatory language. It is intended to foster discussion with stakeholders, which means there's still room for modifications and suggestions as we move forward. Second, the concept language was developed within the baseline regulation, so all proposed additions are noted in underline and deletions are stricken through. Third, these slides have portions of the concept language copied over before a complete comprehensive look at our current proposal for the amendments. I encourage you to take a look at the other document attached to this meeting, which is the amendment concept language itself. All the major concepts are included in the slide deck, but there are further minor changes included in the proposed concept language. And lastly, we're planning to walk through the entire slide deck before going to a question and answer period. But during that period, I'll move around in the slides to help foster discussion. I realize this will be a lot to get through, but hopefully we'll have a robust question and answer period at the end. For this part of the presentation, we have included the exact language from the concept document as part of the slide presentation, but I'll be providing a summary for each piece of the concept instead of just reading everything word for word. So here we have the language for the operational backstops on Tier 0 to Tier 2 equipment. The general concept is the same as what we presented in our kickoff workshop back in May. So the backstops are phased in over time and each fleet size has a different path. Large fleets cannot operate Tier 0s starting in 2024, Tier 1s in 2026, and Tier 2s in 2028. And the other fleet sizes are phased in the years to the right. One new piece of this concept is we have introduced similar operational backstops for older model year on-road engines that are subject to this regulation. This is to ensure that all vehicles subject to this regulation have similar requirements. We mentioned in previous work groups that we would be taking a look at adjusting the low use provision in order to potentially achieve further emission reductions. And to that end, we are proposing to ban the operation of Tier 0 low-use vehicles, as well as Jobs Corps vehicles, starting in 2036. We discussed this idea as well as potentially lowering the maximum annual hour usage, and after feedback from stakeholders, we decided on this approach. The potential emission reductions from this provision will be discussed in a later slide. Another update since our kickoff workshop is we are proposing a delayed implementation of the Tier 2 operational backstop for ultra small fleets. Fleets that are 500 horsepower or less have an optional compliance pathway in the original regulation that was less stringent than the small fleet requirements. So we wanted to provide ultra small fleets additional time for the Tier 2 backstop. Our current proposal is that starting on January 1 of 2036, instead of 2032, ultra small fleets will no longer be allowed to operate Tier 2 vehicles. The proposal includes an extension of the vehicle adding provision, and the requirements on the slide are the same as what was presented in our May workshop. Fleets cannot add Tier 3 vehicles upon adoption of the amendments and cannot add Tier 4 interim vehicles in 2024 for large and medium fleets and 2028 for small fleets. Similar to the operational backstops, we have proposed requirements for similar older model year on-road engines that are subject to this regulation. So starting in 2024 for large and medium and 2028 for small, a fleet cannot add a model year 2006 or earlier on-road engine to its fleet for vehicles subject to this regulation. Several special provisions exist in the original regulation, and we are proposing a ban on adding Tier 0 equipment to these special provisions starting in 2024. These special provisions are dedicated snow removal, emergency operations, and Jobs Corps vehicles. The intent of this provision is to ensure that starting in January 2028, engines subject to this regulation are either California certified or meet a California equivalent emissions standard. This provision would not apply to engines smaller than 175 horsepower that are used in construction or farm equipment. Here we will discuss some other changes to the low use provision. First, after hearing feedback from stakeholders, we're proposing to add a rolling average to the permanent low use provision. In the original regulation, there is a permanent low use and a year-by-year low use provision, and there is a rolling average of hour usage allowed only for the year-by-year version of low use. We are proposing to eliminate the year-by-year version, but we heard feedback that allowing the rolling average to be used in the permanent low use option would allow additional flexibility to fleets. So we have included this in our proposal. This rolling average would make it so a vehicle must average 200 hours of usage or less over a 3-year time period. And as I just mentioned, we are proposing to eliminate the year-by-year version of low use starting in 2024. Two changes to low use reporting are shown here. First, photo evidence of the hour meter must be included when reporting hour usage for low use equipment. Second, reporting had to be updated to allow proper implementation of a rolling average for permanent low use, and the second piece of text does just that. Another potential requirement is whenever an hour meter is replaced or altered for a low use piece of equipment, that alteration must be reported to Carb and must include information on the new hour meter reading. Here we will discuss the potential renewable diesel requirements. First, fleets must report to Carb and affirm that they are in compliance with the renewable diesel performance requirements. Next, fleets have record-keeping requirements related to renewable diesel. First, fleets must maintain records that demonstrate compliance with the performance requirements, and this could include fuel receipts, fueling contracts, or other documentation that demonstrates compliance. Second, there is a provision that we will discuss soon for when renewable diesel is not available to fleets, and in those cases, additional record keeping is required. The specifics of that documentation is outlined in a later provision. Now here are the actual performance requirements for fleets, and these requirements are similar to what was presented at the work group we held in September. All fleets must use R99 renewable diesel starting on January 1 of 2024, with 2 exemptions: captive attainment area fleets, or any fleet that is comprised entirely of Tier 4 final equipment are not subject to these renewable diesel requirements. Here we have the language I mentioned previously for cases where renewable diesel is not available. The language is pretty detailed, but generally, if a fleet cannot access renewable diesel, they must do 2 things. First, maintain records showing that renewable diesel was not available, potentially with communications from fuel providers, contract bids, maps of fueling stations near the job site, or other documentation showing that renewable diesel was not available. Second, fleets must make attempts to obtain renewable diesel at least on a quarterly basis or when going to a new job site, showing similar documentation for those situations. Another substantial piece of our proposed amendments are the additional requirements for prime contractors and public works awarding bodies. To start this discussion off, this slide includes the description of the off-road diesel vehicle certificates that will be a key tool used by the prime contractors. The language states that the certificates will be issued on March 1 of each year for every vehicle that is reported to Carb and is in a compliant fleet. It outlines what information will be included on the certificate, and it highlights that when a vehicle is added to a fleet, it will be assigned a certificate upon reporting, so it will not have to wait until the following March. Here we have the prime contractor requirements. First, these requirements would kick in on June 1st of 2024 to ensure enough time is allowed to implement the vehicle certificates that will first get issued on March 1. 1A requires prime contractors to obtain a copy of the fleet's certificate of reported compliance before hiring a fleet. This certificate is the fleet-wide compliance certificate that is already in the original regulation. B is where the new vehicle level certificates come into play. Prime contractors would be required to obtain copies of the off-road diesel vehicle certificates for all vehicles on their job site and review these certificates. The review would include checking that the EIN on the vehicle matches the certificate, that the make and model of the vehicle match the certificate, and that the certificate has a valid effective date. If non-compliance is discovered, or if there is a discrepancy during that review of the vehicle certificates, the prime contractor must deny entry of the vehicle onto the job site and cannot allow it to perform any work until the issue is resolved. When a new vehicle is added to the fleet, there is some grace period allowed for implementation of the regulations provisions. So it would be possible for a fleet to obtain a new vehicle and not get a vehicle level certificate immediately. We also heard concerns around this at the work group discussing this concept. So we're proposing having a 60-day grace period for these prime contractor requirements to ensure that if a fleet purchases a new vehicle, they will be allowed to use it immediately without issues from the prime contractor. In these situations, though, the fleet must provide the prime contractor with a dated bill or receipt of sale showing that the vehicle was purchased within the last 60 days. Then it can be used on the job site. After the 60 days is over, the fleet must meet the previously discussed requirements, providing the prime contractor the off-road diesel vehicle certificate for the vehicle. This language states that prime contractors must keep records of both the certificate of reported compliance and the off-road diesel vehicle certificates. They must obtain new versions of these certificates on June 1st of each year for the duration of a project, and they must maintain these records for 3 years after project completion. Prime contractors must also report to Carb when non-compliance or discrepancies are discovered for any fleet. A is specifically for any non-compliance or discrepancies discovered at the vehicle level related to the vehicle level certificates, whereas B is for fleet-wide compliance issues, such as not having a certificate of reported compliance. These last items require prime contractors to disclose ownership information at the job site at Carb's request, to provide records within 5 business days at Carb's request, and that these prime contractor requirements do not apply under emergency operations, although records showing that the work is performed for emergency operations must be maintained. Now we have the Public Works awarding body's requirements, and these have undergone some substantial changes compared to what we presented at our last work group. The first requirement is that they must obtain certificates of reported compliance for all fleets bidding on Public Works projects and can only award contracts to compliant fleets. The second piece of the requirement is intended to mirror actions public works agencies already perform for the Department of Industrial Relations. Our proposal involves public works awarding bodies reporting some basic project information to Carb at the same time that they would be reporting to the Department of Industrial Relations, but only for projects that involve the use of vehicles subject to this regulation. We heard feedback after the work group that our original proposal could be overly burdensome to public works awarding bodies, so we have developed this alternative, which we believe is in line with efforts already performed by these entities. This new proposal leaves the vehicle level responsibilities to the prime contractors as discussed earlier, and with this reporting information to Carb, Carb will be able to determine who the prime contractor is for public works projects and ensure those requirements are being met. Both the prime contractor requirements and these public works awarding body requirements will help improve enforcement of the regulation and ensure projects, especially public works projects, are using compliant fleets and vehicles. This last major piece of the proposal will be new to stakeholders, and it is a voluntary flexibility option for fleets who adopt zero-emission technology. As we've highlighted before, the goal of these amendments is to achieve targeted near-term criteria pollutant reductions. But there is a long-term goal for California to go zero emission, and we wanted to include something in these amendments that will help encourage that adoption. Our current idea is if a fleet adds a zero-emission vehicle to their fleet, this language would allow them to keep either a Tier 1 or Tier 2 vehicle operating for 2 additional years past the backstop requirements mentioned in previous slides. This would provide some extra flexibility as well as allow the fleet to keep the Tier 1 or Tier 2 vehicle as a backup for a few extra years while they try out the zero-emission vehicle. This slide discusses what is required in order to use this flexibility. I won't go through all of them, but the more important ones are that the zero-emission vehicle must be performing equivalent work to that of a diesel off-road vehicle. It must have a maximum power rating of 25 horsepower or greater. And the intent is that the zero-emission vehicle and the designated Tier 1 or Tier 2 vehicle should have similar power ratings. So as seen in F at the bottom, we have some horsepower categories that both vehicles must fall into. Reporting on the zero-emission vehicle is also required, and this slide outlines what information must be reported, which is similar to the information that is reported for conventional diesel vehicles. The information reported from the previous slide must be updated if things change, and the fleet must report to Carb which specific Tier 1 or Tier 2 vehicle they would be applying the delay in operational backstop too. And finally, here's a list of some of the more minor potential changes for the amendment. New definitions are added on page 14 of the concept language. There are new fleet requirements on page 20, and we are ensuring that newly reported fleets are subject to these same requirements. On page 36, we are changing the reporting to require federal employer ID instead of taxpayer ID to ensure it's clear that we do not want PII reported. There's an exemption for small fleets when VDECs are not available, and we are proposing eliminating this exemption in the amendments. And lastly, and in direct response to stakeholder feedback, we want to allow backed credit that is generated after the final fleet target year to be used for fleets not meeting their final fleet average target in that year, similar to how backed carryover credit currently works. To explain this further with an example, if a fleet turns over 20% of their fleet in response to one of the operational backstops, and they are still not meeting their final fleet average target, then 10% of that turnover can be used to meet the 10% backed turnover requirement, and the extra 10% that they turned over in that year can be used in the subsequent year to meet the next backed requirement. Now we wanted to share what the potential emission reductions could be from these amendments. We started by using the current version of the off-road inventory as a baseline, and the Air Quality Planning and Science Division will be discussing that baseline inventory in more detail this afternoon. One important assumption we made while doing this calculation is that for this purpose, we assumed that all the Tier 0 to 2 equipment that would no longer be allowed to operate would be replaced by a Tier 4 final piece of equipment. We realize the reality will be somewhat more complex, with some fleets choosing to get rid of their old equipment and not replace it, or potentially designate the old equipment as low use. We just want it clear what assumptions we made at this point in time, with the intention of refining the analysis even further as we move forward. With all that out of the way, we have split up the potential emissions based on each major piece of the concept. The columns show potential statewide emission reductions in 2025, 2031, and 2037, as these are the major attainment milestones as noted in earlier slides, for both NOx and PM. So as you can see, the operational backstops on Tier 0 to 2 vehicles and the vehicle adding changes are achieving substantial reductions in all 3 years. The backstop on Tier 0 for low-use equipment starting in 2036 will potentially achieve over 1 ton per day of NOx reductions in 2037. And lastly, the renewable diesel requirement is achieving some very near-term reductions. As we've mentioned in previous meetings, renewable diesel shows the most NOx and PM benefit when used in older equipment, and shows minimal emission reductions when used in equipment that utilizes SCR and DPF controls, such as Tier 4 final. Therefore, as the overall off-road fleets get cleaner, the NOx and PM benefits of using renewable diesel diminishes, although it is still important that we achieve those much needed early emission reductions. Here we have the same information, but specifically for the potential emission reductions in the South Coast Air Basin. There isn't too much else to say here, but I'd be more than happy to come back to the slide if needed during the Q&A portion. So here we wanted to switch gears slightly and share some results from the cost survey we released several weeks ago. As a recap, we held a work group on our potential cost analysis, where we shared what data we have been gathering, and we also asked for feedback and potential cost data from stakeholders. During that meeting, we heard that releasing a survey might result in better feedback, so we created that survey and released it in late October. From that, we received 19 responses and got cost information for about 440 off-road vehicles. Of the responses, we received a mix of public and private entities, as well as a mix of large and small fleets. I also just wanted to thank everyone who provided responses to our survey, as the information and cost data has been invaluable in improving our analysis for these amendments. One of the more important questions we included in that survey is what might fleet's compliance response be to these proposed amendments? We grouped the responses based on whether a fleet would retire the Tier 0 to Tier 2 equipment and replace it with a Tier 4 final or cleaner vehicle, if they would retire it and not replace it at all, or if they would designate the vehicle as low use. We averaged out the responses and split them up by fleet size and got the distribution as you see in the slide. These percentages will play a critical role in our cost analysis, as we will overlay these assumed compliance pathways in order to estimate the cost to California fleets. So that being said, if anyone has any further feedback on these assumptions, please let us know now so we can make this analysis as representative of fleets as possible. I also want to highlight that we know each fleet is unique and will comply differently, but it's important that we try and understand it as best we can and apply some reasonable assumptions so we can estimate costs for California as a whole, which is the main purpose of these numbers. We also wanted to update stakeholders on further cost updates we've been working on. This slide shows what the estimated cost of used equipment is based on the auction sales data we gathered, which we presented in our cost workgroup on October 15th. What we have done since that workgroup is we used the auction data to estimate the relationship between age of equipment and the price of the used equipment categorized by horsepower bin. In the survey we asked stakeholders, when you look for used off-road diesel equipment, what age of equipment do you typically look for? The overwhelming majority of responses said approximately 5 years old or something very close. For that reason, we wanted to estimate the cost of 5-year-old Tier 4 equipment, and the results of this analysis are seen on this slide. When it comes to new Tier 4 costs, we have a couple different data sources, one of which is thanks to the responses from stakeholders. We have several projects funded through the Carl Moyer program for Tier 4 equipment that provided us with some new Tier 4 costs. And now we also have some cost data provided from stakeholders to bolster that information. The numbers on screen are simply the average of all the equipment in those data sets that matched the horsepower bins shown. And as you can see, they are relatively close to each other. So after sharing all of this cost data, I want to highlight that if any stakeholders have further information or data, please let us know. Barring feedback, we will start taking these numbers and using them to calculate the estimated overall cost of these amendments. So now is the time to speak up and let us know if you have more information that would help us better understand the cost of this equipment. And on that note, we are still lacking cost data when it comes to greater than 600 horsepower equipment. We have a few data points from the Carl Moyer program, and we received one survey response, but we could really use more data showing the cost of the high horsepower equipment. We also think the cost of this equipment might vary more based on the equipment type in these high horsepower cases. We have several data points for scrapers as they seem more popular, but if anyone has cost information for other high horsepower equipment types, please let us know. We are also looking into more data sources such as other doors fleets and equipment manufacturers. But again, if anyone has any cost information for greater than 600 horsepower equipment, let us know. Another part of the regulatory process is analyzing possible alternatives to this concept, and we would like to solicit input to what these possible alternatives would be. We would like to hear from stakeholders specifically for alternatives that could yield the same or greater benefits than those associated with the concept, or that may achieve the same objectives but at a lower cost. Submissions for alternatives should discuss the alternative's ability to fulfill the objectives of the amendment concept and should include cost and benefit information associated with the alternative, data sources, and a clear description of the basis for any cost calculations. These alternatives must be submitted by January 14th of 2022, and they can be submitted to the ORD amendments at arb.ca.gov email address. And now to wrap things up, next steps. First, we're aiming to finalize this concept and develop the proposed regulatory language in early 2022. followed up by potentially having a third workshop to discuss that proposed regulatory language. Then we are still aiming to have a CARB board date by the end of 2022. And here we have our question and answer period. There are two ways to participate. You can either raise your hand and staff will unmute you to allow you to speak, or you can type in the question section of the webinar. If you make a verbal comment, we ask that you introduce yourself and your affiliation. I know we have gone through a lot of material, so if anyone would like me to go back to previous slides to help the discussion, please feel free to ask me to move the slides around. First, let's see what questions have been typed in while I was speaking.
Okay, yes, I can start reading the questions. So the first question is from Marisa Danielson. Question is, how are small businesses supposed to purchase such expensive equipment? Are there buyback programs?
So first for the incentive side of things, mentioning buyback programs. So we had a work group a couple months ago where we discussed what the overlay of the incentive programs might look like with these amendments. So we are hoping to, so the incentive programs might be a potential option, but when it comes to the cost, that's definitely part of our analysis, is understanding what the cost is. So we, that is a big part of the analysis, and there is a cost attributed to these changes for all fleet sizes, for small businesses and big businesses. But these emission reductions have to be achieved, these near-term criteria pollutants, to help reach attainment in the severe non-attainment regions. So we understand there is a cost associated with these changes, but we just need to get these emission reductions.
And that's partly why the smaller fleets have a longer time frame to make the changes. This is above and beyond what has to happen under the current regulation. And so there are actions that are already supposed to be happening under the current regulation. And so this is achieving the additional emission reductions above and beyond that. So we're really only talking about the remaining equipment that's not going to get turned over from the existing rule.
Marisa Danielson actually has additional parts to her question. What does backstop mean? Can you increase low gross? The low gross is too low. And finally, I could not attend this meeting and I have much more to say of the cost. You are moving too fast.
Okay, so I'm not exactly sure about the low gross, but the operational backstop is so fleets cannot operate that equipment in those years. So it's preventing the operation of that equipment. And it sounds like maybe she's not on the call anymore, but I can follow up with her afterwards as well. We can reach out.
Okay, so our next question is from Grant Stickney. Vehicle certificate requirement is excessive reporting. Currently, owners use equipment from doors to show equipment emissions profile. What is the reason for a certificate? A Tier 3, Tier 4 interim adding fleet ban in 2024 is too aggressive, suggest allowing until 2028. Will create an unfair market for California owners.
So to the first one, I'm not sure if this question is coming from the fleet perspective, but the vehicle certificates would not require additional reporting. So what's currently reported to doors, to Carb for this regulation is staying the same. And then Carb would be developing these vehicle level certificates and providing them to fleets. And then the fleets would just have to give that certificate to the prime contractor. So I want to make sure, like I said, I don't know if this is coming from a fleet perspective or a prime contractor perspective. But the reporting should be the same. It's just that Carb will be developing these vehicle certificates and giving them to the fleets starting in 2024. So the second part of the question for Tier 3 and Tier 4 interim additions. So when we developed those years, we, and this was in our May kickoff workshop, is we tried to mirror how much lead time was allowed for the other banning of additions of equipment. So in the current regulation, tier 0s, 1s, and 2s cannot be added to fleets in certain years. And there was a certain amount of lead time provided for those bans on additions. So we mirrored similar timeframes for the tier 3 and tier 4 interim. And I also want to make sure it's clear that tier 3 and tier 4 interim is adding vehicles to a fleet. So in 2024, I believe, for large and medium, and 2028 for small for tier 4 interim, fleets cannot add that type of equipment. It is not talking about operations of equipment. So hopefully that answered both of the questions.
Grant Stickney actually has additional parts to his question.
Okay.
Without the year-by-year low use option, what would be available for specialty low utilization equipment have? And why vehicle certificates? Owners and operators already use DOORS information to show emissions profiles of equipment to contractors. Seems overreaching.
So the second one is, I think the point of the certificate was to make it easier. So like we did here in the work group where we discussed this concept that some fleets already, use like a DOORS lookup and screenshot. And the purpose of the certificate was honestly to be a tool. So you would just get a certificate from DOORS, and then you could just send that to the prime contractor. So the intent was not to make things more difficult. The intent was to be a useful tool for that exchange between the prime contractor and the fleets. If there is a disagreement with that, that's definitely good feedback for us to hear. And for the low use special provisions, there's still currently the permanent version of low use, which, as I mentioned, we're adding the rolling average to. So the idea is that equipment that is being used a few hours annually would be able to utilize the permanent low use option. So we're just getting rid of the year by year because there's two different versions.
The next question is from Harmony Gates. For renewable diesel, how will fleets transition to RD, such as finding renewable diesel producers and sellers? Will facilities need to have separate diesel tanks, or can they mix regular diesel and renewable diesel and demonstrate compliance with purchase records?
So two pieces of this is, so those requirements would kick in January 1 of 2024. So the intent is that would give enough lead time for fleets to figure out the ways in which to get renewable diesel. On top of that, there in the work group where we discussed renewable diesel, there's several very large manufacturing facilities for renewable diesel that are going to be coming online in the next few years. So we expect the availability of renewable diesel to be much greater in the 2024 timeframe. So we expect renewable diesel to be available in the majority of areas. And by having that requirement kick in 2024, fleets should have enough time to make that transition and start preparing for using renewable diesel. When it comes to the fuel itself, working with our fuels people at ARB, renewable diesel is a drop-in fuel, so it can be used in all of the same equipment. So there would not be, you would not have to change tanks or make operational changes in order to use renewable diesel. All it would require is purchasing renewable diesel instead of traditional and then using it in the exact same way from our understanding. And I think that was both of the questions. I'm not sure if there was a third one I missed. I think that was it.
Let me just verify. Yeah, I think that was it.
Bye.
So the next question is from Marisa Danielson again. I have a 600 horsepower D10. The replacement cost is $1.5 million. I have quotes. I need a meeting with Mr. Dean. Please assist. A D10 replacement is $1.5 million. A D11 is almost $2 million. They are over 600 horsepower.
Okay, and this is really good information for us to have. I think what I can definitely have a meeting afterwards, after this workshop. but we definitely want to understand what, sort of costs would be associated with these potential requirements. And I think what would be interesting to understand is how compliance would be met for the baseline regulation. So kind of as Johanna mentioned earlier, there are requirements in the base regulation, and what these amendments are doing is like cleaning up the cases where it wouldn't get turned over for the baseline regulation. So it's hard to really talk about what specifically these amendments would be doing. And I'm not sure if like the example you gave, if that was a tier 0 piece of equipment, and if that would have been able to stay even with the fleet average targets. So I definitely want to follow up, but I also want to be understanding that there is a cost, and we're trying not to be overly burdensome, but equipment that's tier 0 to tier 2 is extremely old, extremely high polluting, and we understand that the high horsepower equipment is more expensive, and we are trying to get more information on that high horsepower cost. But the equipment is so old, and the emissions are needed. So that's kind of where we are with these amendments. And like I said, I can definitely follow up afterwards to have further discussion.
Okay, the next question is from Daniel Langmaid. Why is the zero emission limited to 25 horsepower when Moyer allows less than 25 horsepower to participate?
So that is because the base this regulation only covers equipment that's 25 horsepower or greater. I believe, Johanna, that's the reason. But is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to make sure that the flexibility that we're providing by adding in zero emission technology into the fleet is actually replacing something that would have been covered under this regulation, so that we were, that it's kind of like for like.
The next question is from Ron Nuss. Renewable fuel will be difficult to manage for rental companies that don't control the fuel on the job site.
So I think this came up at the Renewable Diesel Workgroup as well, and I think we want to understand how rentals work and how it would work with renewable diesel. I think the intent is that the fleet who rents the piece of equipment would be the ones subject to the renewable diesel requirement. So a fleet would rent something, and then they would have to ensure that they're using renewable diesel, and the requirement and responsibility would not be on the rental facility. But I think this is definitely something that we would like more information on to understand the relationship between the renter and the fleet using the piece of equipment when it comes to renewable diesel. So any additional feedback on that of how it could or could not work would be appreciated. And if we need like a special, additional language explaining the, how it works with rentals, we can look at that as well.
The next question is from Allison Torres. Can you please clarify the start date for the permanent low use hour meter reads that are used to calculate the 3-year rolling average? Does it start the date you designate a unit as permanent low use?
So I think the intent there is that it would start, you could start that in 2024, but you would have to have 3 years of low use of hour meter readings to be able to use that. So if you wanted to start using that in 2024, you would need to provide us low use hour meter, or your hour meter readings from 2022, 2023, and 2024.
The next question is from Robert Hasselbrock. On the certificates to operate, I am concerned with delays. We have had problems with PERP certs getting out on time and having difficulty on jobs where clients require evidence of conformance. If this isn't managed, then it simply can't work unless Carb is going to be responsible for lost revenue.
I think so. That is a good observation and something we can take a look at. I think what we were hoping is, so the prime contractor requirements were starting on June 1st, and then the certificates were starting on March 1st. So we're hoping that by providing that sort of gap of a few months, it would allow for implementation of the certificates and then have the prime contractors be able to use that tool. This is something where if there's thoughts on a different strategy, we'd be open to that. But I think that was the intent of that, the gap between the certificates and when we would actually be having the requirements kick in. So we tried to address this in the timing of the implementation.
Yeah. And to add to that, the goal on the implementation side would be to issue the certificates directly in the reporting tool, similar to how the fleet receives their certificate of reported compliance at the fleet level. And so when you get your certificate of reported compliance at the fleet level, you would also be able to, that at the same time, it would generate the vehicle level certificates. So as long as you're reporting on time and having and compliant with the regulation, there really shouldn't be a delay there. We've given ourselves a couple extra months because there is, some lag time on, processing of forms and that kind of thing as far as the reporting goes. And so this allows us to have that flexibility. But for fleets that are reporting on time and have all their information in the system, there should not be a delay.
The next question is from Jerry Fernandez. Is there an opportunity for Carb to have personnel to help companies with the grants and funding, such as assign a large fleet a mentor in getting grants and incentives?
So we can share this with the incentive groups at ARB. So I don't want to speak to what the incentives and what they can and can't do, but we can take that feedback and let the incentive groups know that might be something useful. But I don't know if I can say much more than that for the incentive groups. Also, I think we'll take like one more written question. I'm sure there's a lot more, but I want to switch to phones to kind of let people raise their hands, and then I'll alternate back and forth. So.
Okay. We have one more question then from Marisa Danielson again. So she mentioned that she's still on the call right now, and her questions are, this equipment is old. Why not just let these equipment naturally go away? Why can't you just let low-use equipment continue? If we only use the equipment seasonally and not much, why not just let them continue?
So to both of those points is that it is old, and what we've seen is that it's not being turned over naturally. So that's kind of the intent of these. So the equipment is very old, but from what we understand and what we've seen in like the doors reporting is that the equipment is not getting turned over because it's still operating and it's still useful. So to the second point though is that low use is still an option. So equipment that is used minimally will still be allowed to be used under the low use designation. So the low use option is still an option in these amendments. So I think with that, we will switch to phones. We'll give Henry a little break.
Thank you, Nathan. We have a raised hand from Edward Phillips. Edward, you have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself to speak and state your name and affiliation.
Thank you, Eddie Phillips, BNSF Railway. Hi, Nathan. Hi, Joanna. So I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to make these comments. These are just from my notes today, so they're not in any particular order. On the issue of renewable diesel, I'm a little confused because I am under the impression that Carb is working on a renewable diesel standard for statewide. And so what I'd suggested in my letter to you was that if Carb adopts a renewable diesel standard, that you just, there wouldn't be any record requirements for this equipment. And, obviously that would take some time for not only Carb to adopt the standard, but for the refineries to start producing that. We're following this issue very closely. We're very interested in renewable diesel, not only for our offer equipment, but for our locomotives. And I can tell you right now, I really doubt that we're going to have enough R199 or R100 available by January 1st, 2024. I think that's a little optimistic. I could be wrong, but it seems almost like it's a little bit of putting the cart before the horse here. And so in my comment letter, one of the things I stated was trying to keep the regulations simplified. If renewable diesel is mandated by Carb through a renewable diesel standard, then the records that you're proposing here would not be necessary. Because you could only buy R99, right? Just like you can only buy ultra low sulfur diesel today, and Carb, of course, adopted that standard several years ago. So please consider maybe modifying this so that you allow the renewable diesel standard that Carb is developing to fully get adopted, put into place, the refineries start ramping up production, and then you can completely eliminate the reporting requirement for renewable diesel here. I want to thank you for the comment on the 2 additional years. I know that was something I suggested. I had hoped for 7, but I'll take the win for the 1-to-1 on zero emission, right? That was a good addition. And then I want to clarify the back carryover. You're proposing to allow 10% beyond 2024. That's an addition, right? Okay, good.
Correct.
And then Nathan, I didn't see, maybe I missed this. I didn't see a table on the ban tier 0 through tier 2. Did you have that on one of your slides?
So I tried to make it fit one slide. So let me.
Yeah.
So I have the large one, and then I just added what years the small and mediums would be implemented. So this is like the actual language, and it has 2024 for large right here, tier 0, tier 1, 2026, tier 2.
Okay, so every 2 years. Okay, good. And the reason I asked that is that at the last workshop, I asked Corey Palmer about the tier 0 through tier 2, and he stated that 60% of the NOx reductions you're seeking are the tier 0 through tier 2. So after, on January 1st, 2028, you've eliminated 60% of the NOx without renewable diesel if you ban the tier 0 through tier 2. So I just want to confirm that. And then on the cost assumptions, I'm glad to see you reached out to Ritchie Brothers. We had talked about that. They're a good source. But again, I want to underscore that in a normal year at Ritchie Brothers, you have a normal supply and demand scenario. But when Carb adopts a regulation that forces retirement of a 30 to 40-year asset, before that company was ready to give up that asset, what you're doing is you're flooding the market, and that causes the prices to crash. So if you want to go back to Ritchie Brothers and ask them what happened the last time Carb flooded the market with their off-road regulation, you'll see that if it's $100,000 in a normal day, in a normal year for auctions, but you flood the market because you're forcing retirements, that price is going to drop significantly. And my anecdote last time was I was on a Southwest jet to Sacramento for a meeting, and there was a guy coming from out of state, like Texas, and he flew all the way out here to pick up a piece of equipment that he picked up for like 20, 30 cents on the dollar. In Texas or whatever he was, he could have bought that for say 80 grand, and he picked it up for $20,000 because it's just supply and demand. It's economics. You put an extra 1,000 pieces of equipment on the auction block, people are going to be able to pick it up at pennies on the dollar. And so please go back to Ritchie Brothers and ask them about the last time Carb forced early retirement of equipment, because that's what happened. And then finally, on the AB 617 piece, I had suggested in my letter, and I'm going to reiterate this here, we need GHG reduction statewide. Renewable diesel will get you about 75% if you do a statewide adoption for all equipment, not just off-road. But you only need NOx and diesel PM where you have non-attainment or you have an EJ community. So I'm recommending, again, that you make this regulation only apply in those areas. So air basins that are in non-attainment and or have EJ components. So a huge portion of the northern part of the state, there's really no need for this. Renewable diesel, yes, but you don't really need the NOx and PM if you don't have highly dense populations and EJ communities. So please consider that again, because it's a huge burden for a lot of people. Thank you.
Thank you. A couple things I wanted to respond to. So that was really good feedback. That was really good information. One of the things you had mentioned about the renewable diesel standard is I think it, like we can go back and talk internally about what that renewable diesel standard is proposing and what it's going to look like and what it could require. But I think we, at this current time, is still proposing, requiring the usage of it. I'm not sure if the standard would require certain entities to use the renewable diesel, but we can follow up on what that standard looks like. But you had also mentioned about the 2024 timeframe and potential availability issues, and that is why we have that long bit of text about if renewable diesel is not available. the fleets can show that they could not access it, and then they would not be held responsible for not using renewable diesel. So we have heard all of these potential projects that will be completed by 2024 that will increase the renewable diesel production greatly. But if there is a case where renewable diesel is not able to be accessed, we have that language to allow.
Yeah, and that was my, I mean, Nathan, I hear what you're saying, and that was my point. I mean, if renewable diesel becomes standard through adoption of a renewable diesel standard by Carb, then no fleet would have to keep any records, because the only fuel they can buy, like ultra low sulfur diesel, is renewable diesel, and it relieves the burden of that additional requirement. And the running joke I have is that Todd Sachs better start printing up a bunch of badges, because we're all enforcing Carb regulations now. So and so I understand what you're saying. I don't think it's going to be ready widespread in California in the volumes we're going to need. And so what's happening in the way it's proposed today is you're placing an additional burden to do that search and be able, the other team that's developing the renewable diesel standard. You'll have some more information to find out when do they think they'll adopt the standard. Is it going to be an R99 or an R50? And then maybe you talk to some of the refineries who that team's probably talking to as to when they're going to be able to ramp up. Again, we're following it very closely. It's part of our greenhouse gas reduction strategy for locomotives to use renewable diesel. So we kind of know what's going on here in that space. And then one comment I actually forgot about their certificates. When you talked about a fleet would have to verify compliance with a piece of equipment, right, or reject it, right? So on the TRU website, any member of the public can check the compliance of a TRU unit. And I just double checked doors because I couldn't remember, but you can't do that in doors. But if you put a button there that said for the public, check compliance for a fleet or an individual piece of equipment, you could eliminate that requirement. You could just tell them really simply, go on the doors website. If I'm hiring a company to do construction, I can go on the doors website with the public access button and go into that company's fleet and check not only an individual piece of equipment, but whether that fleet's in compliance with the regulation. That eliminates all the paperwork. All I would have to do is reject any piece of equipment that wasn't compliant. And then, because I mean, I'm just trying to keep it simple. We all want to do the same thing and get to the same place, but I'm trying to think of a more elegant or simpler way to get to accomplish those tasks that you're trying to get to.
No, we really appreciate it. I did want to mention that we did have some communication from the folks in our fuels group, and they were saying that even if we do adopt a renewable diesel standard statewide, it won't be for some time, and in the availability it would not be available for the entire, we wouldn't have enough for the entire need, the diesel need in California for some time. And so what we are trying to do with putting, the requirements in the off-road rule along with what they did for commercial hovercraft is getting the renewable diesel into the equipment, into the sectors where it can have the most impact early. So we know we get the most reductions when we get it into the equipment while the older equipment is still being allowed to be used. So we are trying to get those early NOx reductions through the use of renewable diesel. And so that is why we are out in front of whatever statewide regulation that may or may not be happening down the road.
Yeah.
So we understand that there's an additional, hurdle there with the paperwork. I imagine that if we did get to a place where, it was, renewable diesel was just the conventional diesel in California, that we would perhaps go back into the rules and not require that, remove that requirement for the fleets. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but I agree it would seem silly to keep documents that you're using the only fuel you could use.
Yeah.
So I would hope we would be reasonable and find some way to work around that.
Well, and I think a better way to look at this is the state has a GHG reduction goal, and renewable diesel is going to help us get there before we get to full zero emission, which is 15, 20 years. So we might have time to wait for renewable diesel standards statewide and eliminate the reporting requirement, because it sounds like if you already know that the renewable diesel is not going to be available, you're just adding the compliance obligation.
No, I wasn't saying it wasn't going to be available enough available for the off-road sector, it wouldn't be available to completely replace ultra-low sulfur diesel statewide in the at the volumes that we have right now. But what we are trying to do is targeting it what is available to the right sectors. And so we do think that it will be available in the 2024 timeframe at the volume that the off-road fleet needs.
Okay, I mean, have you considered the locomotives and other uses? Because we use quite a bit of it, quite a bit of fuel. So, all right. And then I forget, I had something else, but I forgot already. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And one other thing I just wanted to highlight to one of your other comments is just so you had mentioned about like the need for statewide reduction. So there were two things I wanted to mention, and one was, so South Coast and San Joaquin are in extreme non-attainment, but there are many other regions that are in non-attainment, as I highlighted, and like you mentioned, the EJ communities. So there are many regions in California that need to get these reductions. But another point is that, PM is a toxic pollutant, so there is, health impacts of those emissions in whatever region that they're being used in. But also third is that something that we're concerned about is potentially like large fleets who maybe have equipment all over the state. If we had this requirement not uniform across the state, there might be a way for them to just shift their equipment and put their dirty equipment in regions that don't have the requirement and make that area dirtier, and just keep their clean equipment in the regions that do have that equipment. So I think that there could be an opportunity for like large fleets to shift things around, and that opportunity would not be available to small fleets who just have a regional presence. So I think there's several reasons why we're looking at this as a uniform statewide requirement. I just wanted to share that.
Nathan, I think most of the work goes where the business is. So when you develop, like if you're developing a site, you're gonna have construction equipment there. For companies that don't use equipment in construction like us, like BNSF, we're gonna use the equipment where we have the right of way, and that's not gonna shift. I think is when you concentrate on the areas of the basins that are in non-attainment, you'll see probably the vast majority of the work and the operation of this equipment is gonna take place. Sure, you're gonna have some of the equipment in the northern part of the state where it's the attainment's not an issue. It's not just an assumption blanket wide across the state, right? There are concentrations in pockets of activity, just like for on-road trucks, for example, right? We have corridors. So, okay, thank you. I know there's others that wanna follow me, so I'll come back if there's time later. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next, hand raised.
Yeah, we've got a hand raised from Rebecca Baskins. You have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself to speak and state your name and affiliation.
Hi, Nathan and Johanna. Rebecca Baskins on behalf of the California Advanced Biofuels Alliance. We're the state's trade association for renewable diesel and biodiesel. Not a question, but a comment. I first would like to thank you and other staff for the inclusion of renewable fuels in these amendments, but we would like to see the inclusion of other renewable fuels like biodiesel and renewable diesel blends. Blending renewable diesel and biodiesel together maximizes the environmental and economic profiles of both fuels. For example, blend of renewable diesel at 80% and biodiesel at 20% is similar in NOx reductions and reduces more particulate matter than R99. Blends also help alleviate cost and supply concerns. We will submit comments with more specific numbers and reductions, but I wanted to thank you for your hard work on this, and we look forward to continuing working with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that feedback. Next, hand raised.
Yeah, our next hand raised is from Joseph Williams. You have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself to speak and state your name and affiliation. All right, he's actually lowered his hand. We can go to the next one. Or it's raised again. You've got to hit the red icon, the mic icon to speak. All right, we can do a different one. We've got another. Got a raised hand from Bill McGavern. You have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself to speak and state your name and affiliation.
Thanks. This is Bill McGavern with Coalition for Clean Air, and I just want to make some overall comments, mainly about the need for this rule. We know that this sector is responsible for a very high percentage of our criteria pollution. We desperately need the NOx and PM reductions, and that's not just in select areas, that's really all over the state. We desperately need PM reductions and NOx reductions in virtually every part of the state. So we support moving forward with this update, both on the engine standards and on the fuels. And renewable diesel is something that I've studied pretty extensively, and definitely agree with your approach of getting the renewable diesel to the places where it can have the greatest benefit. And that often will be in these very old off-road engines. And so I'm not surprised that you're showing substantial benefits in the early years. And those early years are really highly significant given the lack of attainment in the parts of the state where almost the entire population lives. So we'll continue to follow this and be involved. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for that feedback.
Thank you. We have our next raised hand from Harmony Gates. Please unmute yourself to speak and state your name and affiliation.
Hi, this is Harmony Gates with York Engineering. You guys have been so responsive to my emails. Thank you. I just wanted to ask about slide 38. I'm not sure if I just missed it, but you mentioned a tier 0 backstop for 2036. Did you discuss some kind of final backstop, even low use would no longer be available?
Yes. So the current proposal is that in 2036, so I'm trying to find where it was. Yeah, it's right here. So in 2036, we're proposing that even in low use, a fleet would not be able to use tier 0 equipment.
And is it only tier 0 right now that you have a final backstop for?
Right now, yes, that's our proposal. And a big part of that was the emissions impact. So as you saw, like just the low use tier 0 equipment in 2037 was over a ton per day of NOx. So
Okay, permanent low use.
that's our current proposal.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We've got our next raised hand from Kevin Wheeler. Kevin, you have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself to speak and state your name and affiliation.
Kevin doesn't want to talk to us. Maybe move on to the next.
Yeah, maybe we can come back if there are audio issues. Now you're muted too, Amber.
Sorry, I've unmuted Bob Shepard. Bob, you can unmute yourself to speak and state your name and affiliation.
You hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, Bob Shepard from Quinn. So I have a few things to kind of go over. I guess I'm a little confused on the outright ban on tier 0 for large fleets come 2023, when a good portion of the fleets have used credits to get to that point. A lot of them are going to be somewhere in the 3 gram, 4 gram level because they were allowed to use the credits. And so when it comes to 2023, now all of a sudden they're going to be blasted with having to get rid of all the remaining tier 0s out of their fleet, as opposed to allowing it to attrition under the existing program that allowed continuing 10% turnover until you met the final compliance with tier 0s and tier 1s. I would suggest actually looking at it a different way and saying, look, you are going to find between 2023 and 2025, 2026, a good portion of that tier 0, tier 1 is going to be gone because credits are washed up on 1/1/2023 for large and medium fleets. So why don't you look at something more along the lines of starting out in 2026 and then looking at, okay, maybe a little more aggressive, 15% per year, because by 2026, there's not going to be a whole lot more left to go out of the fleets. Instead of this one fell swoop in 2023, which doesn't go along with what the original plan was. That's the first point I'd make, and I think you need to take a longer look at how this is really going to play out with the existing program and how much you're actually going to get within the 2023, 2024, even 2025 timeframe from large and medium fleets as opposed to the one fell swoop. On tier 3 purchases, okay, we get it, but instead of making it 2023, I think you need to shift it to 2025. And the reason that, small fleets just get banned from purchasing tier 2 on 1/1/2023. So now all of a sudden they're banned from tier 2 and tier 3. So I think by shifting that date out to January 1, 2025 might be more appropriate. On the ban of tier 4, I can't see that. The whole regulation originally started as a PM reduction, and with those vehicles, those machines, they already have the PM reduction, and it is also a very good tool for fleets still to use to be able to meet their final fleet average. If you just take that away in 2024, you've now put a huge burden on small businesses, small fleets, things like that are still along this cycle to be able to meet final compliance by 2028. So I would suggest not doing the tier 4 interim ban at all. The next thing is what Grant Stickney had also said, and others have already said, once you put the bans out there of being able to purchase this equipment, you're also going to wreak havoc on the used equipment market. As far as the low use, yes, as long as you're rolling in the fleet average or the 3-year average into that, I guess year by year could go away. I mean, that's kind of my view on that. On renewable, there was a question that came up on rental and the mandate on rental to be responsible for making sure that the renewable fuel happens. You can't put that burden on the rental fleets. We have no idea what happens out in the field. I mean, there are times where we get back water trucks that have red dye fuel in them. We have no control over that. We charge the customer when it comes back, but we cannot control what the customer uses out in the field. We could certainly be set up with renewable fuel, but on that concept, I think the biggest concern here, not only supply, but this renewable fuel is already there's money going into it from the government to keep the price somewhere close to where diesel is. Well, with all government funding, that ultimately goes away. So now what you have is a mandate that presses a much more expensive fuel on somebody that shouldn't otherwise happen. I mean, instead of being $4 a gallon or $4.50 a gallon, it goes up to $8 a gallon. I had several different presentations that I did back in October, and I got asked the question several times about why don't we look at incentives on that and maybe target a 2028 date instead of 2024 for any mandate. Try to build in some incentives to help the people still try to meet the off-road regulation, maybe even going back into the last couple of years for those people that have used renewable fuels, and provide some kind of an incentive basis to get them some extra credits after those are wiped away from the first round. Yeah, we already talked about the concept of requiring contractors, the hiring and all that, and the certificate. I mean, if you're providing the certificate, yeah, it's one means. Like I'd already mentioned, we already are doing screenshots of things, and I guess if we have the certificate, I know Grant said that is kind of like overkill, over reporting, and I certainly would agree with that. Anytime you have to come up with all these additional steps to showing this or that, I mean, it's just a lot more burden on the businesses to comply, but I get it. That's kind of it. Those are kind of my general feelings. I'd like to be able to discuss some more.
That's really good feedback. So I appreciate all of those thoughts. A couple things I wanted to respond to. So one was, we are requesting like potential alternatives that get the same reductions. So you would like propose potentially like having like a more stringent percentage turnover in like certain years. One thing that I wanted to highlight is in our first work group, we kind of mentioned like we wanted to kind of go this flat out ban of tier 0s to 2s because it's simple, easy to understand, easy to implement. But we could have looked at doing like a lower fleet average target, kind of like what you were, not exactly what you were suggesting, but so we kind of started off thinking that the flat out bans were a more straightforward way to go forward. But if you had like an alternative approach that, as I was saying in the alternate potential section of the presentation, if you have like other ideas, we'd be more than happy to hear about that and look into that more. But I think, like I said, when we started this process, we really wanted to make it simple and easy for fleets to understand what's required, and it seemed like just banning tier 0s, tier 1s, tier 2s in certain years was the best approach forward for that.
Can I? But on the tier 0 part of it, I mean, you really have to look at the impact. If you're saying, hey, right immediately after January 1, 2023, when all the credits go away for large and medium fleets, you're saying large fleets have now got to get rid of in that same calendar year, 2023, everything else that's in their fleet that's tier 0, and they could have 25% of their horsepower perhaps still tier 0 at that point because they've been using credits up to that point. So that's why I say I think you need to take a look at a shift. There has to be some allowance to allow the original current regulation to play out, and kind of look at something that kind of comes along in a couple years later, 2026 thereabouts. Because I tell you what, all you have to do is run calculation on every one of the fleets. In fact, we provided information back in 2018 on this whole concept, and you're going to find in those 3 years, aside from small fleets, you're going to find tier 0, tier 1 are pretty much going to be gone after the first 2023 for maybe latest 2025. There is one more thing that I forgot to say too, and that is the cost data. Please go back. There was a letter that Kayak sent on December 18th. In that letter, there by the horsepower categories, each one of them, there was a listing of the prices. And at that time, those were accurate prices to the current standards. Now, I noticed in your chart, you didn't even include the 600 to 750 or the greater than 750. And when the person came on and talked about the D10, they're talking about that horsepower range. But I know you're going off of perhaps Moyer data. You kind of got to look at a whole bunch of different aspects. Please go back to that letter because I believe that you're low, very low on the prices. What we gave back in 2018 has now gone through several different CPI indexes, and especially this last year with supply demand issues and things like that, they've gone way up. Back in 2018, a 600 to 750 was probably in the $1 million range. Greater than 750, 1.8, and again, you got to index that for 4 years with the CPI at least to get to current values of those machines. And then each one of the other ones, like I said, are low on what you presented today versus what was presented by Kayak back in 2018. So.
Okay.
That's good feedback. So I definitely appreciate that. Just a couple other things that I just wanted to highlight in response to some of the other things you said. So you were talking about the ban on adding Tier 4 interim and how the reg was originally a PM rule. But I just wanted to highlight that, its origins may have been PM, but NOx is extremely important, and reaching attainment in those non-attainment regions is a big, push for why these amendments are happening. So I understand that that was the original intent, 10 years ago. But NOx is very important, and that is a big piece of the goal for these amendments, whether it started off as PM or not.
Understood, but NOx is the primary goal in the South Coast and the Central Valley, not necessarily throughout the entire state.
Understood. I mean, like, there are other non-attainment ozone regions as well, but I understand what you're saying. So I definitely am hearing the feedback. And then one other thing I just want to mention about renewable diesel is you had mentioned, government funding, and it is true that the reason that it's at cost parity right now is because of, mainly because of LCFS. But from our understanding and our work with our fuels folks is that isn't going away anytime soon, the LCFS program. So we're hoping that it would, it's a credit. I don't think it's technically an incentive, but the LCFS should be around in the future. But we are understanding. So I just wanted to highlight that I do understand what you're saying about how renewable diesel is the price that it is to fleets right now because of that LCFS program. So we would, be aware of that situation. But LCFS is expected to be around for quite a while. So, and then I will look into the letter that you had mentioned from. I'm assuming when you said December 2018, the year 2018, not December 18th, correct? From Kayak. I'll try and find that letter that you referenced. So. Oh, okay. And then one other thing is, so you mentioned
it went to Todd.
I have the letter, Nathan.
Yeah, and I think
I think we have it.
Yeah, you would have that, correct.
Oh, and then the last thing is so you had mentioned how our cost data didn't have greater than 600 horsepower. And that's because we haven't had much data received from anyone. So we are very open and willing to receive cost information for 600 horsepower greater. So that was kind of why we didn't have much in the slides, is because we haven't received much. So definitely we'll look at that letter, but if anyone has any data for 600 horsepower, that would be greatly appreciated, because we want it to be representative. We want to know what the cost is for this high horsepower equipment. So definitely provide feedback would be great. And that was, I think, my list of responses. So thank you for your comments.
All right, you're welcome.
I think we'll do one more hand raised, and then we'll go back to the written questions.
All right, thank you. So we have a hand raised from Cosmin Duca. You have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself to speak and state your name and affiliation.
Hi, Cosmin Duca, Volvo Construction Equipment, Sweden. I would like to add some things to what I hope I recall the names in a good manner, Bob and Grant said. And that is mainly on the fact, first of all, on the renewable fuels. One thing that you have to take into account is that maybe we as engine manufacturers, we also have to certify these engines to be sure that they will be able to run on these renewable fuels. There is a long discussion with one of the states in US where they use a different type of fuel that it goes over a little bit with what our engines are certified for. Second of all, regarding these machines that will come out tier 0, tier 1, it might be that these machines will land on states neighboring California, and that maybe do not have the same regulation. And yeah, I'm I mean, the clouds still travel and the pollution is not eliminated fully. So maybe there should be a trial to compensate for this in a smart manner. One thing that I would like to add on the zero emissions machines, I'm taking more part in the PEMS test that we do at Volvo Construction Equipment here in Sweden. And we also have a lot of oncoming zero emissions machines. So I had discussions with our customers using and large or small fleet owners about this introduction of zero emission. And one of the questions, or most of the questions, were who will ensure that we will have the infrastructure to house these machines on our sites? Because some of them, for example, we were forced to give up on some PEMS tests because there was no access to electrical current on the site at all. And our equipment runs on recharging batteries for the PEMS equipment. So we didn't have a place where to recharge our batteries. So of course, their question was, well, we will recharge our machines then. So bottom line will also be that some of the deadlines also seem very tight, depending on what needs to be taken into consideration also by engine manufacturers, not only the fleet owners. As mentioned, we need to certify that. And maybe a little bit of a stupid question regarding the 25-mile regulation. Is that air measured or land measured? So we avoid any type of future discussions.
Yeah. So to that last question, I'm not sure if we actually thought about it. I don't know if there's a preference from stakeholders of what that 25 mile, or if even the number 25 miles is the best number. But I think we're open to what makes the most sense. Whatever maybe is easiest to show, like if it's 25 by air, so it's just a perfect circle around the facility. But I will admit we have not thought in that much detail about the 25 mile. So if there's feedback on what makes the most sense, we're definitely open to that.
Yep.
I'd just like to address one thing with the renewable diesel, that renewable diesel is already ASTM approved. So my understanding is that there's no need to certify the engines in any other different way or certify the fuel. It's already fungible to the diesel already sold in California. So I'm not sure there's an issue there. The other thing is I was not clear. The proposal we have isn't necessarily requiring the manufacturers to certify any new engines. It's just using the requiring fleets turn over the equipment to the cleanest engine standard that is already manufacturers are already required to manufacture engines to. So I'm not sure I understand that comment. So if you could explain that a little bit better for me.
Well, of course, that every type of fuel affects the way the engine operates, and moreover, it affects the EAP system of an engine. And now, depending on the components of the fuel, we could get damages on these components. I'm exaggerating it. It doesn't mean that it has to be like that. But depending on the fuel composition, we might end up after 5 or 10 years seeing, I don't know, a degradation of one of the components just because of one of these fuel components that hasn't been tested properly and certified. One other thing that, for example, I faced here, again, PEMS related and this renewable fuels, we in Sweden, it's very common to use HVO 100. But for example, for myself, when testing machines with HVO, it was quite hard to get hands on the technical description of the fuel composition that I need to put into my analysis later on. So that, first of all, I had to get a lot of discussions with fuel manufacturers in order to get this data from them. Also, the supplier of the equipment and the analysis tool was unable to know all of these details. So my idea was that we need to sort of first pave the road before we impose something, because we might be able, as fleet owners or engine manufacturers, to reach these deadlines, but then we might hit our heads on minor things that will either stop the fleet from running, or later on having to give explanations on why one of the components failed or another.
Okay. Yeah, I think the basic point we're trying to make here is that the renewable diesel that's used is just California diesel, and it meets all of the California diesel and federal diesel regulations. So I think the proposal that we have is maybe slightly different than what you're seeing in Sweden, because it's the same, it's just diesel fuel. So okay,
Yep.
thank you.
One final comment is regarding this fleet owners' duty to keep all these receipts and everything, and even to demonstrate that there was no fuel available. Wouldn't it be wise to have some sort of a database that it's updated by the fuel manufacturers, that a fleet owner, for example, can check at any point to see where the fuel is available, or if it's available or not, or anything like that? So, I mean, now we introduce 5G, and there's a lot of possibilities to have this live data implemented from different petrol stations or stuff like this, or fuel manufacturers.
Okay, thank you for the comment.
Yeah, and one other thing I just wanted to highlight quickly to the comment about zero-emission infrastructure is, we can relay that information about the concerns about infrastructure, but I just want to make sure it's clear that the zero-emission proposal in these amendments is completely voluntary. So we would not be forcing anyone as part of these amendments to use zero-emission, which I just wanted to highlight that based on your comment about infrastructure concerns. So.
Yeah, I fully agree, and we also understand that it will be quite hard to comply to future regulations without having more and more zero-emission machines, or close to zero-emission machines, that imply sort of using either the grid for electrical current, or maybe, I don't know, hydrogen or stuff like this. But all of these require a certain infrastructure to have it. And at this point, some of our customers do not have it. And there's a question regarding costs, and there's a question, of course, regarding availability. Most of them, they work during daytime. Some of them work during nighttime as well. What will happen when everyone will plug in their machines to be loaded or anything like that? So there's a lot of concerns, not only from us as engine manufacturers or fleet owners, but also from the final customers as well.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll go back to written questions. So, Henry?
Okay, so for the written questions, we got some from an hour ago. Should I start with those, or?
Let's just keep going chronologically, I guess.
Okay, got it. All right, so we have a question from Ron Nuss at 9:40. What is the website to input cost of equipment? We just purchased a 2018 used Tier 4 final DAT dozer at 365 horsepower for $800,000. I think your cost for equipment is low.
Okay, that's good feedback. So that was, you can send like information and data like that to our ORD, actually let me go here, ORD amendments at arb.ca.gov. So we don't have like a virtual input tool, but you can send emails with information like that to us. And that's really good information to share, so thank you.
Next question is from Greg Stevenson. Hi Nathan, how do you define construction equipment or vehicles? There is no definition that I can see. Likewise, farm equipment or vehicles is interesting. Regards, Greg.
So that language, so I know you're specifically referencing, let me pull it up. Oh, where is it? So this language at the end, it states for 175 horsepower construction and farm equipment. So the intent with this is that this is the type of equipment that's federally preempt. So I believe we can look into if we need to add a definition for construction equipment and farm equipment to specifically for this piece of the language. I don't think construction equipment and farm equipment is used anywhere else. So this is just something new that we added, and we added equipment that is, like I said, federally preempt. So we can look into if we need to add a definition or not for that, but I just wanted to, like, that's the intent of this language and what those vehicles are referencing.
Yeah, and it has to do with the operation of the vehicle. So if the vehicle's used and operate in construction, or it's used in agricultural, on farms, then it would be considered construction or farm equipment. There actually is I think ARB has a website that actually has kind of a list of equipment that is federally preempted, and you can probably Google that and get that list of equipment. But if you're asking about general applicability of the regulation, if you go to the handout that's in the proposed concept language that's in the handouts and open that up and you look under applicability, you can kind of see generally how we define the equipment that's subject to this regulation.
Okay. The next question is from Jerry Fernandez. Most of the slides discuss the addition. What is the plan for Tier 3 equipment? What is the drop dead date?
So I think the question, I guess, is in terms of operations of Tier 3 equipment, and there's not currently in our proposal plan to ban the operation of Tier 3 equipment. So I think that's what the question is, but if you want to clarify, feel free to. But right now, our proposal does not include a Tier 3 operational ban. And then there's you cannot add a Tier 3 starting upon adoption. So I'm not sure if maybe that was referencing the vehicle adding provision. But feel free to clarify if I'm misunderstanding something.
The next question is from Andy Recalde. You're absolutely making compliance extremely difficult with all the additional record keeping requirements.
So I'd be interested in what's like specific record keeping requirements. So I think the only changes we're having is renewable diesel related and some slight changes to the low use reporting. So I'd be curious to know like what specific record keeping is being referenced, and maybe if there's like feedback on how to make it any different, like we'd be open to that. But our renewable diesel record keeping requirements are kind of needed to ensure compliance with that regulation, with that piece of it. So I don't really see a way for us to not have that type of record keeping. And like I said, if it was referencing something else that I'm missing from our proposal, like different record keeping, please let us know, or clarify for me.
Okay. The next question is also from Jerry Fernandez. Will Carb provide a location on the door's site for prime contractor lookup for companies such as the State Contractor License Board?
So I think our concept right now is that the prime contractor would be getting the fleet-wide certificate of reported compliance and the vehicle level certificate, and they would just be using those two certificates, and that they wouldn't be using much in terms of like an online tool. I'd be curious if there's like thoughts on if there's something that would be helpful, but right now that's our current thinking, is that there would be those, those two certificates. The prime contractors would receive those certificates and, check compliance using those tools.
But I do think that the intent is that we will have an online submittal form for them when they do need to report non-compliance. We already have an online submittal form where the public can submit complaints of non-compliant equipment, but we would have something specific for the prime contractors for their portion of that.
The next question is from Ron Nuss. I'm not sure what he agrees to. It's been a while. It says, I agree. Please remove the certificate for contractors. For rental companies, it's going to be a lot more paperwork for the office that is already overwhelmed trying to comply.
Okay.
Okay.
The next question is from Marisa Danielson again. What kind of grants are available?
So, if I remember from the work group we had where we talked about incentives, we talked about the potential overlay with the Moyer program and some of the zero-emission programs that are coming soon. And we had a couple slides on like when Moyer funding could potentially be available and how that would work. So I can send you a copy of that presentation where we talked about the incentives specifically. I don't want to speak to it now because I don't want to say something wrong off the top of my head. But we did present sort of what we thought could be some programs available in terms of incentives, and I can share that with you.
The next question is from Jared Yamasaki. How will zero-emission vehicles factor into the fleet average calculation? Also, with the proposed carve-out for forklifts with the proposed zero-emission vehicle forklift regulation, how will this be treated under the fleet average? Specifically, if a fleet is using Tier 4 final forklifts to meet the fleet average, would they be required to turn over other equipment that they otherwise would not have had to?
You want me to try to take this
Yeah.
one, Nate? So first I'll just kind of like, how is zero emission equipment dealt with in the fleet average right now? So fleet, if they adopt zero emission technology right now, and it's a type of vehicle that was displacing a diesel vehicle in their fleet, that is calculated, they can incorporate that into their fleet average today, and it gets an emission factor of 0. So if you can bring in zero emission technology now into your fleet, you get a really great benefit to meet your fleet average targets. So that's kind of how zero emission technology is dealt with today in the calculation of the fleet average targets. And that's in the regulation now. As far as the zero emission forklift regulation, we're working really closely with that staff to understand any kind of overlap between the two. They have not finalized their applicability for their rules, so it's really hard to say how the two regulations will interact at this point. They're planning to have their next workshop early 2022, and I believe the applicability of that rule will be more they'll have a little bit more structure around what they're thinking of making, of what would be covered under that regulation. So we'll have a lot more clarity at that point. So I don't want to give an answer on the second part of your question because we don't know what is actually going to be subject to that rule at this point. So, but we will make that very clear once their applicability has been finalized.
Thank you, John.
Quick question from Harmony Gates. So mixing is okay regarding the fuels.
So, yeah, from our understanding, it's a drop-in fuel, which means you can add it in any, equipment tank and it'll operate fine. So from my understanding, yes, that is a acceptable with R99 renewable diesel specifically.
Next question is from Joe Meyer. Will the DOORS site, particularly the compliance calculations page, FTFA backed, a fleet average target, fleet average, and backed, be expanded beyond the current stop of January 1st, 2023 to align with the potential ORD reg changes for transparency?
So I'll let Johanna speak to like the website or like what that would look like, but the intent is that the credits earned before that final fleet average target would expire still. And then you would be able to generate new credits starting after the final fleet average target. But I think the question was a little more about like the website itself. So I don't know if Johanna.
So the plan is that we will be extending out that table with the fleet average targets and the fleet average and the fleet average for those fleets that aren't meeting the 2023 or if you're a large fleet, the final fleet average target, and you're in that turnover place after the final target date. So we will have that table be extended out so that you can see your fleet average target drop down to meet the target. It's very confusing. We can go, it'd probably be easier to go over that with like the compliance snapshot open so fleets can see it. So if you want to follow up with us, go ahead and contact us and we'll follow up with your fleet specifically. But yeah, the intent is that table will be extended out so you'll be able to see your target.
The next question is from James Gilmartin. Is the Water Resources Board online with putting renewable diesel in USTs?
I'm not sure if I understand. Can you read it one more time? Is Water Boards okay with?
We're putting renewable diesel in USTs.
If you could,
is that a tank?
Yeah.
Yes, USTs are okay with renewable diesel.
Okay. The next question is from Cosmin Duca. For renewable diesel topic, when you measure distance of unavailability, you refer to 25-mile radius air measured or land measured distance. Also, do you plan to impose the creation of a database with live data managed by fuel providers that the fleet owner can check for availability of renewable fuel?
I think this is the same commenter who spoke up and raised his hand. So I think this is a similar comment. So definitely open to if stakeholders think air or land is better for the 25-mile horsepower. And thank you for the feedback on the other piece of the comment.
Next question is from Allison Torres. Renewable diesel availability logistics concerns. The proposed renewable diesel not available section is confusing and logistically challenging. My public agency has our own diesel dispensing locations for services provided in our 555 square mile service area. Please confirm whether the proof that renewable diesel is not available is limited to our dispensing locations only and not retail stations located throughout our service area where jobs occur.
So I think the intent would be that your service stations would be required to provide you with renewable diesel unless they were unable to get it. So you as the entity that's subject to this regulation are required to obtain renewable diesel unless it's actually unavailable, not just your fueling stations or your dispensaries don't have it. Those dispensaries would then, need to be a change in operations where those dispensaries would need to try to obtain renewable diesel.
The next question is from Eileen Hartsock. The Advanced Clean Fleets seems to be pushing against having renewable diesel options. Is it worth the expense of going to cleaner diesel if everything is pushing towards electric and hydrogen? Are there any protections for the fleets changing over to renewable diesel for that option being usable for a decent amount of time?
So to the first comment, and what we highlighted is really the renewable diesel use is getting us some very near-term criteria pollutant reduction. So we do understand that the long-term goal for California is zero emission, but there is, NOx and PM benefits that can be achieved in the very near term if we use renewable diesel. And based on LCFS credits, the cost of which is at what we've seen is at cost parity with traditional diesel, so it wouldn't be expected to be much of a cost to fleets to utilize. So for those reasons is why we're really looking at this renewable diesel piece. Oh, I forgot what the second part of the question.
And the renewable diesel piece doesn't require any new engines. So this is just swapping the type of fuel that you're using from conventional diesel to renewable diesel. There's no change in the vehicles, there's no change in the engines, you don't have to change your tanks. It really is just changing the fuel that you're obtaining to put into your vehicle.
The second part of the question was about, is there any guarantee that renewable diesel will continue to be an option for a decent amount of time?
Oh, yeah. So, and we kind of spoke more about this at the work group when we talked about renewable diesel, but there is expected to be like a increase in production of renewable diesel. So as time goes on, renewable diesel will only become more available. So the expectation is that it will be around and available in the future and only increasing as time goes on from our understanding.
The next question is from Kerry Sandoval. If we move a piece of equipment into low use, will the horsepower be calculated in meeting compliance? For example, if I move an 87 horsepower equipment into low use, then this would allow me to deduct this horsepower from our overall usage in helping to meet our compliance goal.
So double check with Johanna to make sure it does work that way, but I think it does work that way, where you designate something as permanent low use and then it is not used in the
Yes.
calculation.
So this goes back to how credits are calculated under the existing regulation. And for permanent low use, you do generate backed credits for that designation, as long as you have to maintain the usage under 200 hours per year. And so that we are not proposing a change to that. So you would still generate that credit under the current regulation, and then in that vehicle comes out of your fleet average. And however, we do have the added part in this rule where, or in this proposed amendments, where we will be instituting an operational backstop for the Tier 0 vehicles in low use in 2036. So it gives you some extra time with that vehicle, but it's for, at least for Tier 0 vehicles, there is an operational backstop there too.
The next question is from Ron Nuss. 2 years is not enough time to implement the renewable diesel requirement due to infrastructure and delivery. Please consider, rather than a fleet being 100% Tier 4 final, maybe it could be 75% Tier 4 final and not have to be required using it.
So we can look into that. I think our thinking is that it wouldn't require too much of a change in operations or equipment, like Johanna was saying. It's just purchase a different fuel. So we weren't thinking that that would be overly burdensome to switch to in a 2-year time frame. But we definitely hear your feedback, and we can look into the second comment. But again,
I would, if Ron has, or I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but if you actually have specific challenges that your fleet will have with switching over to renewable diesel, it'd be great if you could reach out to us with those details. But we think that, we do understand that there will be some operational changes that have to happen, because you will have to potentially change your contract and logistically try to, figure out how you're going to fuel your vehicles. But we do think 2 years is a relatively good amount of lead time for that kind of change. So, but if you have additional concerns, and you have some, data to support that it will take you longer than 2 years, please provide us that information.
Ranas has another question. I like the idea of still having lower tier special equipment machines for permanent use. Most of these machines are used in a repair yard for repairing equipment and not used very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
This you might have addressed already, from Harmony Gates. Clarified Tier 0 backstop in 2036 on slide 38.
Yes, that was her verbal comment.
Next question is from James Gonzalez. The cost of newer Tier 4 final equipment should be easy for you to get from any equipment dealership. Funding for new equipment should be made available as a part of the amendment.
So we are definitely looking into manufacturers to get that cost data. To the second point, is so we can like coordinate with some of our incentive groups to talk about that sort of thing, but the incentives aren't really, an amendment isn't really the place where we talk about like incentives and have incentive programs. So we can definitely have conversations like within ARB about incentives, but amendments and regulatory language isn't exactly where we have that sort of discussion. And like I said, in our previous work group, we kind of highlighted where we thought the Moyer program might overlay with these amendments, and like the clean off-road equipment or clean off-road equipment voucher program, because they're looking to expand to zero-emission construction equipment. So we've discussed where some incentives within ARB might be applicable in this sector. So hopefully that answers that question.
The next comment is from Chris Jones, who actually is no longer attending. Here's his comment. Strongly support the use of Carb issued certificates for compliance to make verifying compliance by public works agencies more uniform. The certificates of compliance should identify tier rating. Also, there should be a public lookup for community public transparency. Is the intent to have public works agencies also to verify renewable diesel usage of public works projects?
So we hadn't actually thought of having that as part of the public works requirements. I'm not sure if they would have like the boots on the ground knowledge or how exactly we would implement them getting the information that renewable diesel is being used. I think just having renewable diesel required for everyone kind of will cover the cases when they're used on public works projects. But it's something we can try and look into. But right now, we don't have like that level of detail at the public works level in terms of renewable diesel. Also, before you read the next question, Henry, so a little bit of a check. Do you know how many like written questions we still have left? Is there?
It's a lot. We're an hour behind.
Okay. And Amrit, how many hands are raised right now?
We have one hand raised.
Okay. We'll take a few more written ones. We'll take that hand and then we'll go back to written ones. But a few more written ones first.
Okay. So the next question is from Rod Winkle. In regards to the proposed operation backstop dates for large fleets, does this include low use equipment as well, or will we be able to continue to use this equipment under the low use provision?
Yes, so low use is exempt from those operational backstops on tier 0s, 1s, and 2s. So you will be able to continue to use as low use that equipment, with the exception that we mentioned of having a tier 0 backstop in 2036 for low use. So in 2036, you cannot use tier 0 even as a low use, but everything else you can use in the low use provision.
The next question is from Ron Nuss. Great idea to make a link to check the equipment and company for compliance.
Okay.
Next question is from Allison Torres. Will the Carb reporting for public works projects be through doors?
So I think we haven't quite gotten to the implementation of it. I think we would have some mechanism online for that reporting, but I don't think we've gotten far enough. And I don't know if Johanna, you want to speak to this.
Yeah, I know we haven't actually got, I think the intent is to have an online place for the public works entities to report the project information, whether it's indoors or some other just like online form. I don't know that level of detail yet, but it will be, we will have like an online submittal for that.
The next question is from Michael Lewis, who has left. Is ag equipment included in this proposal? If not, why not?
So currently ag is exempt from the regulation and we're maintaining that exemption. So ag is not covered. Ag is handled by a different group at ARB, so we can definitely work with them and relay any information about ag to that other group. But the base regulation at 100% agriculture operations is exempt and handled separately, and we are maintaining that same structure with these amendments. I think we'll take one more, Henry, and then we'll do the hand, and then we'll come back.
Okay, the next question is from Andrew Lembeck-Edens, who has left. I missed a portion of the meeting earlier. Is the renewable diesel a requirement for all vehicles operating diesel equipment, or is utilizing renewable diesel a pathway for compliance?
So it is the first. It is a requirement. So all of the other requirements are still in place, the operational backstops, but also there's this requirement to use renewable diesel. So it's not an optional pathway. It's you have to do both things. I feel like I explained that weird, but. Okay, so we'll take the hand now, I think, Amrit.
Thank you. We have a hand raised from Scott Hedrich. You have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself to speak and state your name and affiliation.
It's Scott Hedrick with Renewable Energy Group. Hopefully you guys can hear me. I see a few nodding. We're one of the nation's largest manufacturers of both biodiesel and renewable diesel. So no, you didn't state that weird. Two things, and we'll certainly follow up with staff on this. I think it's important to note that while renewable diesel is a drop-in, it is not D975. It doesn't contain the aromatics that D975 has. It doesn't contain some of the other additives, although the pieces that it contains are similar to the pieces that are within D975. There is a big difference. Cetane is significantly different. You're talking about a cetane of over 70 in most cases versus on-road diesel, ULSD, being in the low 40s. And so what we've seen is that there could be some performance issues with that in low RPM heavy duty diesels. And when you think about off-road, there's more low RPM heavy duty diesels than on-road. So it leads me to my next comment. I guess I would ask you to loop back internally with the strategies division. Blends of RD and BD are approved for on-road use as NOx neutral. And I think that would take care of a couple of potential problems with respect to performance. But there's also something that I don't think anybody's touched on, but it's important for you all to understand. When we talk about off-road, we're talking about dyed product that doesn't pay the on-road tax, which means we have two systems of fuel handling, not just in California, but in the US. And because of the peculiarities of federal law, there's only one, maybe two renewable diesel manufacturers that are able to sell dyed fuel to the consumer without having to collect the on-road tax and then having to refund it later. And I'll say that again because it's important. For everybody who is not on a pipeline, who's manufacturing renewable diesel, under federal law, we have to collect the on-road tax. Then we can seek a refund for off-road use and take care of that. But that could be a 6-month to 9-month delay. That's going to translate directly to scarcity of availability off-road because of the vagaries of the business cycle. People aren't going to want to see their resources tied up. And we're talking about money that's in the 50-cent range, I think, when we're looking at federal diesel tax. So it's not insignificant. So when you look at the exceptions for what I'll call RD deserts, you're going to find, I think, many more exist than what you normally or would have thought otherwise. One way to address that is to increase the pool of available fuel, which would be to allow 80-20 blends. And I can't stress it enough. The other half of Carb has already approved it for on-road. So if it's good for on-road, it should very much be good for off-road. Again, we'll follow up afterwards. I know this is a lot of work. It's a lot of heavy lift. There's a lot of detail and data here. we do make the fuel. We do have technical folks, so I'm happy to, like I said, link up and run through all those specifications for you. Thanks.
Thank you for that feedback. And I think someone from our fuels group was willing to respond because they are on the call.
Hi, this is Lex Mitchell. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Lex. I manage our emerging fuels section at Carb. We deal with the fuel specifications regarding criteria pollutants. I just, there's a lot to unpack there, Scott, but the one thing that I did want to address is that renewable diesel is an ASTM D975 fuel. It's been a D975 approved fuel for some time. I'm not sure if that's a point you were trying to make, but it sure sounded like you were saying that it is not an ASTM D975 approved fuel. And it meets all of the California requirements for California diesel. It's ASTM certified. So, regardless of the intricate chemical distinctions between petroleum and renewable diesel, that's a whole separate issue. But I did want to clarify that particular issue because I think that's a very important point.
Thanks, Lex.
Is it, I don't know, can you hear me? Is it possible to respond real quick?
Yes,
So I won't get into it's a logic construct here. It meets all the criteria, but is it D975 approved? And when, again, you look at all the things that are under D975, R99 or R100 doesn't have it, right? So it's wonky. I would love, though, to hear Lex, if he could confirm, though, that the 80/20 blends are approved for on-road usage.
Yeah, so I don't think it is wonky. I think that ASTM D975 has certain provisions. The Department of Measurement Standards under the California Department of Food and Ag controls quality specs. They refer you to ASTM D975 as well. I'm not aware of any R100 that's sold in California that doesn't meet that spec. So, maybe it would be great if you could submit comments of why you think that it does not meet that spec. R80 B20 blends are approved in California, but approved is different than the proposal that's set forward here, which specified a specific fuel with specific properties. And it's not just on-road. R80 B20 is just straight up approved as an allowed fuel. But like I say, allowed is different than a specific formulation.
Yeah, and I think the intent with the R99 was that we are really looking to get some early near-term NOx reductions with the introduction of this provision. And so NOx neutral isn't where we're looking. We're looking to get early near-term NOx reductions. That's really the intent of that part of the proposal.
Okay. Thank you for your comments. And I think, Amber, are there other hands?
There are no hand raised.
Okay, so Henry, we'll go back to our long list of written questions.
Of course, next question is from Joseph Williams. JW Advanced Technology. My business proposal has a 2.5 PM capture tailpipe suit for the heavy-duty sector. Wouldn't be a big help for Carb to mandate the system for the heavy-duty sector to place on all vehicles' tailpipes? There's no need to destroy perfectly running Tier 6 to 7 vehicles when a robust system can be in place.
So maybe if you want to reach out and give us some more information about your technology, we can look into it. I will say, from our understanding, the Tier 0 to Tier 2 equipment is just extremely polluting, and I'm not sure exactly what your technology could do to the Tier 0 to Tier 2. Like I said, if you want to reach out and provide some more information, we'd be happy to take it. But right now, our proposals is just focusing on preventing the operation of that oldest, dirtiest equipment. So like I said, feel free to reach out.
The next question is from Jianying Xiao. Will Carb require the equipment to carry the certificate on board, or just a record in the paperwork? Any chance of using mobile devices or apps to track the certificates so that it's easier for reporting and verification?
So we can look into how this gets implemented. I think right now the proposal just requires that a certificate gets sent from the fleet to the prime contractor. And in terms of having something like on the vehicle or specifics like that, we can kind of refine further. So definitely if you have feedback or suggestions. And then I think we can look into like an app or like something like that. I'm not sure if right now our proposal is just to have certificates, but we can kind of like, if you have feedback, we can definitely look into it. So I mean, I think it's a good idea. So, but well, we can just.
Yeah, the current proposal doesn't require that the certificates, like a piece of paper, resides in the vehicle. The intent is either the fleet provides the certificate to the prime contractor prior to the vehicle coming onto the job site, and so they can either do that with the paper certificates, or they can submit. The way the fleet level certificates work now is they're a PDF that you can download through your account indoors, and so we would be issuing the vehicle certificates in the same manner as that, and so you will have an electronic version of that, and then you can submit those to the prime contractor electronically. So that was kind of what we were thinking. If you have a different idea on how we could do that, please let us know.
The next question is from Ron Nuss. Please consider on page 21 of the handout, rather than being 100% Tier 4 final, that you consider companies that are 75% or greater to be able to not have to use renewable diesel. The on-road regulation has always been an average, unlike the on-road regulation. Also, the amount of emissions saved probably can't even be measured. Thank you.
So we can look into it. Just as a little background of why that language is there is because as I mentioned, renewable diesel's NOx and PM benefits are minimal when used on technology that has DPF, SCR, which is Tier 4 final equipment. So if a fleet is entirely Tier 4 final, the use of renewable diesel would not show much of a NOx and PM benefit. But in the case of like if a fleet was only partially Tier 4 final, there would still be some NOx and PM benefit if used in the rest of the fleet. And what I'm thinking is that fleets wouldn't procure different types of fuel for different vehicles. I feel like that, we thought that would be complex and not in line with how a fleet would purchase fuel. So right now the exemption is just if your entire fleet is Tier 4 final, you don't have to use it because the benefits are minimal. If you're not entirely Tier 4 final, there would be some benefit in the non-Tier 4 final equipment. So that was like our reasoning behind this language. We can, we hear your feedback and we can look into it, but I just wanted to highlight the context behind why we chose this. To hear your comment, but thank you.
Second question from Ron Nuss. Like Bob said, the equipment cost analysis needs to be looked at again. Machines have gone up the past 2 years. I will be happy to share what we have spent lately.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Comment from Kevin Wheeler. Any 76 station that offers diesel has made the switch to renewable diesel.
And I think we've heard that as well, that there's quite a few stations that offer renewable diesel already now. So appreciate the comment. Thank you.
Next question is from Jerry Fernandez. What has the research provided for engine replacement with all the issues with engine chips and other systemic delays of the newer engines? Are there enough engines available for 2023 deadlines?
So I think this has to do with the implementation and compliance with the current regulation, and the current regulation does have provisions for manufacturer delay. And so I would encourage you to look at those provisions, and we have we have a provision already in the regulation to manage that. And if you have questions about that provision, I would encourage you to contact the DOORS hotline and we can point that provision out to you specifically.
Second question from Jerry Fernandez. Are there any credits provided for the current use of renewable diesel 99? If so, where can we locate this information?
So I'm not sure if credits as in credits in like the original regulation. I don't believe there's credits in the base regulation for the use of renewable diesel. If that isn't what you meant though, feel free to type in a response.
There's another question from Jerry Fernandez. If we convert the majority of our equipment with on-road engines with greater than 2010, how will they be calculated?
So in terms of the operational backstop, and I'll let Johanna chime in with calculated with like the base regulation, but the operational backstops, we have what model years are not allowed to operate as well. And actually, let me go to that slide so I can show. So if you're using a 2010 on-road engine, in terms of the operational backstops, you will be compliant. But I'll let Johanna speak up. Yeah, so like a tier 2 is a 2003 or older on-road engine. Those are not allowed to be operated. So if you're using a 2010 on-road engine, you are good in terms of the backstops. But I'll let Johanna chime in about like calculation in the base reg.
Yeah, so to use a 2010 engine, on-road engine, for calculating the fleet average, you would need to input the engine information into doors like you normally would, and there's a place to click for a non-standard engine. And you would select that, and then you would need to provide the executive order for that engine to, you would email us at the doors email or call a doors hotline. And then what we will do is we'll take the emission factors or the standard that the engine is certified to off the executive order for that engine, and we'll manually put that into doors, and those are the emission factors that'll be used for that engine in your fleet average calculation. So there is a process already established for using on-road engines in the fleet average.
Thank you, Johanna.
The next question is from Carrie Sandoval. What date will the off-road vehicle certs going to start? Do we need to keep these certificates with each vehicle?
So they will be issued first on March 1 of 2024, the off-road vehicle certificates. And then I think this, what was the second question, Henry? Sorry. Like part of the question.
Let me see.
Sorry, I threw you off, huh? I think it was what is being done with the certificates, and the intent is just that they will be sent to the prime contractor, and then they'll keep that record. So, and as Johanna mentioned, that they'll be implemented similar to the certificate of reported compliance. So there'll be like a PDF created, and then you'll access it via your DOORS account. So I think that addresses the second question.
The question was, do they need to keep the certificates with each vehicle?
Oh. Yeah, so right now, like, sorry, what were you gonna say?
Well, I was just going to say, how a fleet wants to manage that for themselves. If they wanted to keep the certificate in the vehicle, that's something that they are welcome to do. There isn't that requirement. We aren't proposing that requirement. It's really up to the fleet to decide how they want to transfer that information to the prime contractor.
Okay, so the next question is from Richard T-Bay. Is there any R99 available that is locally sourced? That is, the feedstock and or the product itself produced in California and not from foreign sources?
So I can't speak completely to this, but I know that there is production of R99 in California. I'm not sure where the feedstock comes from, so I don't want to speak to that. We can definitely follow up with our fuels people to like get more information about that. But like I said, I can say that there's renewable diesel production in California. I'm not sure like if the feedstocks, where exactly the feedstocks come from. So it's something we can look into. And I think.
Well, and I think you can look at the LCFS dashboard, and there might be some additional information there that you could gather, and then reach out to California specific providers about where they get their feedstock.
The next question is from Allison Torres. I have a question related to restrictions for bidding public works projects. What triggers the public bidding constraints for the public works project? A wastewater agency has larger contracts, i.e. new construction, as well as smaller maintenance type contracts. Understanding which contracts are subject to the bidding restraints is key. For example, an agency may have a contract for asphalt maintenance and repair to patch repair asphalt on a city-county owned street, not owned by the public agency. In this case, many contracts related to public works requirements would not apply. If contract-related public works, do the off-road fleet verification and bidding restraints apply? I suggest clearer language for this topic and some additional discussion on the applicability so impacted agencies are clear on their requirements.
So this is really good feedback. And I think if you want to reach out and like suggest any clear language. So this is kind of, as I mentioned, this is our first time presenting this piece of the concept because we've changed since our work group when we talked about it the first time. So we're definitely open to making alterations to make this clearer. I think the intent is that we would want this to apply whenever there's a public works contract, like whenever public works projects are happening that involve vehicles subject to this regulation, we would want this to kick in. But definitely the wording can be refined based on feedback from stakeholders. So definitely like really good comment and really good feedback. And if you want to reach out and suggest anything specific, definitely do that.
Yeah.
But that was the intent. So.
Yeah, and I would encourage you to look at the concept document, where the full comprehensive document, because we actually do include definitions for public works and public works awarding body that might provide some additional clarity.
That's a good point. Yeah, we have in the definitions area on page 14, I believe, we have some definitions for public works and stuff related to this provision. So that might hopefully help.
Oh.
The next question is from Janet Bad. Has the ARB taken into account or considered that equipment manufacturers can void warranties if renewable diesel is used in the engines?
So I think this came up in the renewable diesel work group as well. And renewable diesel, because it is D975, I believe, is I'm not as familiar with the terms, but it is considered meets the same specs as conventional diesel. So I think we've looked into this, and because it meets the same specs, it doesn't void any warranties, and there's no warranty issues when specifically talking about R99, R100, because it is equivalent to it's diesel fuel. It meets the same specifications.
And if you are being told that by engine manufacturer, we would appreciate if you would reach out to us and let us know specifically, who and what kind of equipment we're talking about. That'd be really helpful.
The next question is the last question we have on the list from Bob Shepard. Keeping a certificate on a machine is not practical, especially for rental. Once rented, we have no idea what the end user may do with the document, which could create an inappropriate enforcement situation for a rental company. The certificate should simply be presented as would be requested by a contractor.
Okay.
That's good. And I think it is good for us to, so like if you have feedback on like how the prime contractor certificates would be implemented for rental fleets, we definitely want to hear like thoughts on that. Just in terms of like the logistics of how it would work for rental fleets. So appreciate the comment and definitely willing to hear more about how this would work with the rental fleets.
The questions are coming in again. So a comment from Ron Nuss. A comment. Please don't make it a requirement to keep the certificate with the machine. There are no glove boxes and some machines don't have cabs. This would be very difficult for a rental company that has no control over who operates or transports the machine.
And so That's good feedback, and we are not proposing that right now. So we'll make sure we'll probably leave it out of requiring it on the vehicle. So appreciate the feedback.
Here's a comment from Bob Shepard. There should be no issue with warranty with R99 or R100. The issues arise with biodiesel or blends of biodiesel that do not meet the D975 spec.
Great, thank you, Bob.
Yeah, thank you. Also, before you go to the next one, I just want to check, since we got through the initial list, are there any hands raised, Amrit?
There are no hands raised.
Okay, well, let's keep going with the.
And there are no more questions.
Oh, okay. So I'll stall for a minute just to see if maybe any ideas will have sparked. Appreciate everybody's feedback so far. And like I said, so the next steps is, we'll refine this concept language and have actual proposed reg language in the, early next year. Most likely very similar to what you see today. So like that's the next step. We're still aiming for a board date in the late 2022 timeframe. Yeah, I'm just kind of stalling to see if there's any last questions, any hands or written comments.
There is a new question.
Okay.
From Alison Torres. There are many CARB regulations in the process of adoption that are all occurring simultaneously. Is this regulation, along with other mobile source regulations currently in the works, being coordinated with each other? For example, fleets will be required to purchase only Tier 4 units in 2024. Are these fleets going to be forced to turn over these Tier 4 units as part of another zero-emission vehicle regulation in the near future? The moving target creates challenges with planning and also stranded assets.
So that is a really good comment, and that is another reason why we, highlighted this slide of all of the different regulations and programs related to off-road coming down the line from ARB. And I want to highlight that all of these programs, our team is very closely coordinating with all of them. I know especially, the zero-emission forklift regulation, the Tier 5 regulation. So we are coordinating to make sure that all of our programs, align and don't have, undue overlap or, issues with some overlap. So we are coordinating very closely with all of the different upcoming regulations that are under development. So generally, yes, to the are we coordinating?
We have a question from Jerry Fernandez. Is there any opportunity to get credits for removing Tier 2 engines early, like Carb did? Not sure what this would involve.
I guess I'm not necessarily understanding the question. Like if they implemented the operational backstop on Tier 2 early, they would get credits for. Are they willing to be unmuted and maybe ask their question?
And one other thing I would highlight while maybe we unmute the person is that there's still the baseline regulation. So if someone turned over a Tier 2, there'd still be credit. There'd still be a purpose to that action as part of the baseline regulation. Just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah. So I think Jerry's been unmuted. Thanks, Jerry, for be willing to speak up.
Yeah, Kate, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. In the past, like with Carb, what they did was they allowed 1 year or 2 year, and I know that's why I said I'm not sure what this would involve. They allowed 1 year additional. If we got rid of Tier 2 engines, they gave us a year on the Tier 3 that was expiring in the 2025 range. So we're able to get rid of a bunch of Tier 2 engines and give an extension on some similar equipment for 1 additional year, which allowed us not have to purchase those engines during that tight time frame.
Okay, so like if we
Yeah, I don't know how you would do it, because you really don't have, you're not going to eliminate a Tier 3. So I'm not sure, but maybe it's a percentage of what you get rid of could be put into your credits. I don't know.
Yeah, so what we are proposing as part of the amendment, so in the event, like I think someone mentioned earlier that there will be some large fleets that will have more than 20% tier zeros in the 2024 timeframe. What we are proposing that if you do have that kind of situation and you do have to turn over, you have the operational backstop in 2024 for your tier zeros, and you have to, you know, there's 20% of your fleet that you aren't operating anymore, you can use that 10%, and you're on the 10% backed path because you're not meeting your final fleet average target.
Right.
You can use 10% in 2024 and 10% in 2025 to meet that requirement. So you can kind of use the operational backstop impacts to spread your backed out. So there is sort of that. It's super confusing.
Right.
I
So
cannot explain that very well.
Well, so
But
fortunately for us, we're not in the position where 20% of our equipment is in tier 2. I probably have 7 pieces of equipment. And remember, my equipment are oil rigs. So they're like, for a small one, it's 1.2 million. For a double rig that we utilize for the abandonment of oil wells in California, they're about $1.4 million every day of the week. So we only have 7 and they're all in low use and they haven't hit a lick because I'm waiting for funding to put engines in. So that's what, I was just trying to figure out ways that, maybe there's additional funding available if you got rid of tier 2s early. I don't know. I mean, I just want that to be sort of a thought process someplace.
okay.
The other thing I wanted to comment about that I mentioned earlier in a written statement, when I want to check a contractor, I can go to the California State Contractors Licensing Board, put that contractor's number in, and it'll tell me if the contractor's license current, if he has current stuff. So having something similar to that in the door site where they can go in and say, hey, they told me their number is, 7289, and then it shows the prime contractor. Yes, all these vehicles are in compliance. I think that might be something we should look into, and I don't think it would be a tremendous add-on to your current door site.
So yeah, I think there actually is a public information lookup right now where if you have a fleet's doors ID or their company name, you can actually type that in and you will be able to see whether or not they have a certificate of reported compliance right now. It
Right.
will not, the vehicle certificate, it doesn't exist right now, so that's not there. And I don't know that we would actually post those online because that would provide some what some fleets considered CBI out there. And so part of the reason we want the prime contractors to review the vehicle certificates is because we want that extra check to make sure that because doors is a self-reported system, that the information being reported to us is also accurate. So that kind of provides an additional check there for us. But to get back to what you were saying previously, I'd be really interested if you could provide some cost data on the workover rigs, because that actually is one of the places that we have some gaps in our cost information. So, and we know that there are some fleets out there where they primarily are workover rigs, and so their cost situation might look very different. So if you could get us some data on the cost of workover rigs, that would be awesome. And then I do want to also mention, if they are in low use, the operational backstops would not apply. So like if you had tier 2 vehicles in permanent low use, there's nothing in the current regulation that would require those to stop operating. So there's already, it's kind of already managed within the current proposal. But I don't know if I'm understanding exactly your situation, right? So we could talk offline too, if you want.
Or unfortunately, in the low use, I'm on a year to year. I never know, 200 hours I would do in a month if this rig was working. So I just put it in there to allow me to be able to put a new engine in so I can repower it. Now I am working on a couple things I think that you guys are getting at. I'm working on electrifying a rig right now, but that's down the road. Unfortunately, a lot of our producers that we work for won't have the infrastructure at their facilities, because we're in outlying areas, of course, to power that. So what I'm going to end up having to do is provide a large generator to power the rig, and I'll use a generator with, RD99 fuel, but I'm still going to have to use a generator to make an electric rig. To me, it's counterproductive. And I also, Joanne and Nathan, I will get you some more data on the above 600 horsepower engines. I have those, and they're a limited use, but I do have some that are 835 horsepower and 700 horsepower.
Okay.
So those would be ones. They're very, very expensive right now, and that's the other issue. Is I'm not sure there's a whole lot of Tier 4 final engines in those categories available still. I mean, there may have been some available. I'm just not sure they're available because of all the shortages.
Okay.
All those require chips for their ECM to be able to give us the engine hour data and everything that's going to be required. So I just don't want, it seems like, I hate seeing Tier 5 on here, because in PERP, they told us there'd never be a Tier 5. So it's a little frustrating to see a Tier 5 number in here. But I understand what we're trying to get to. And, I just think I know Bob Shepard and I have worked a lot in the portable equipment, and sometimes I feel like we haven't allowed what we've already put in place to take effect before we start a new reg, before we add more onto the regulation. So, I mean, some of the people have talked about, well, if we can get this type of reduction and Tier 2s are going to go away, does that really need to be in the reg? And I guess you do. Yes, it does, because your smaller fleets still don't have the opportunity to maybe purchase at the time. But I'm telling you, even large fleets like mine, I have 156 pieces of equipment in your DOORS database, and I struggle for funding. And previously, I couldn't get Kyle Moyer because of the amount of money that was being made. But with the decline that we've had over the last 6 years, there's very little CapEx available to us. So it just puts us in a real awkward position. And we're one of the companies that are trying to abandon the oil wells so that the governor can meet his requirements on that as well. So it's just, the more regulations that keeps coming in, it's just really hard to keep up with it. And, we're working on the clean, advanced clean fleets. Well, that specifically is for truck and bus, right? But then we have this other stuff indoors, and there's a PERP regulation. If you take that for a company like mine, we're looking at $63 million in the next 3 years for replacement of engines, and that's a substantial amount.
Okay.
So that's why there is a lot of pushback. If we could do a little bit more, we're going to attempt it. But the other problem is, and I don't know about others out there, maybe they'll speak on this, but with all the vendors I have in my local area, the most changes I can make are up to, unless I'm buying new equipment, but the most changes I can make to 2-engine vehicles is about 10 engines a year, because it'll tie every one of the local providers up. So if there's 6 of our companies out there and we're each trying to do 10 engines, it's gonna be a backlog on that as well.
Okay.
So those are just to try to get you to understand some of our concerns that are coming. And we've been working at years. We've always been a member of your guys' teams, and we appreciate everything you're doing. Sometimes it's just a little difficult for us to make these strategies up that we feel like we had a good strategy, and now it's sort of a little slipping away from us.
Okay.
I appreciate you guys' help.
Thank you. That's really good feedback. Okay, are there any hands raised or written questions?
No hands, but we do have a comment.
Yes, there is a comment from Ron Nuss. That was a good point. Construction sites are in remote areas with temporary power only, with no charging stations for electric machines.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's understood, and that is one of the operational challenges with making construction go zero emission. And so we totally recognize that. We are actually, just to put a plug in for the core program, that's the Clean Off-Road Equipment Voucher Program. And that program, Carb just took their low carbon transportation funding plan to the board in November, and it included an expanded core program, which hopefully will be able to include construction equipment. So it'll help guide us to better understand where construction might roll, or zero emission might roll out in the construction world. And that includes the use of mobile power units, which I was actually going to mention to Jerry, is that might be an alternative to bringing out a generator, is to bring out a mobile power unit. And I do believe that there, I may speak wrong, that those might be eligible for funding through that program. So I would encourage folks who are interested in the zero emission technology to follow that program. I am being told that mobile power units are eligible for funding in core. So if you are interested in that, that's a great, they're gonna, I believe, start having some work groups at the beginning of next year. So hopefully that ties in nicely to the zero emission optional flexibility that we're proposing as part of these amendments, to provide some, you can go get your voucher, and then you can, get some experience with the equipment, and use that as, use the flexibility that we're providing in the amendments. And so we can get some of this equipment out there into the fleets and get some experience using it in real life scenarios. So that would be really good.
Okay, any other written questions, Henry?
Yes, there actually is. From Jerry Fernandez, can you give us the mobile power equipment site?
So I think we can send out probably like a
Yeah.
core, like,
Yeah, I think I can, I will see if I can find the website really fast, and I can put it in the, oh, I'm gonna put it in, is there a place to, it's californiacore.org, all one word, but is there a way that I can put it in,
maybe in the,
like a chat, or?
I think
I think you might be able to respond to the question.
Okay.
Or you could do a chat to everyone.
Oh, yeah, there is the chat. Okay, I'm gonna put it in
Not
there.
everyone could have the website if they're interested.
And then there is another question from Ron Nuss.
Okay.
A lot of sites are no noise before 7 a.m. and after 5 p.m. How can a gen unit run all night to charge machines?
It's a good comment. I'm not sure how the mobile power units, I'm assuming that they would be quieter, but that's also, part of the challenge. That's good feedback. Any other written questions?
No, there are none.
Any hands raised, Amrit? Assuming still
Nope,
no.
no hands raised.
Okay, so I think, we're pretty much on time. I think we can wrap up the morning session. As I mentioned, we'll break for lunch, and then at 1, we'll have our air quality planning and science division present on the baseline off-road inventory. So stay tuned for that second half. And then if any other, if questions come up based on these amendments, feel free to reach out. You can send us, let me go to the, just to put this up on the screen one more time. So you can send any questions, comments, feedback to this ord@amendments@arb.ca.gov email. So feel free to reach out. Also, if we get through the inventory discussion and all those questions are answered and someone still has something they want to say about the amendments, we can always loop back. So we'll kind of regroup after lunch. So unless there's anything else, still no hands or questions, right, Henry and Amrit?
No hands, no questions.
Perfect. So I think we can wrap up, and we will come back at 1 p.m. Welcome back, everybody. It is 1 p.m. Hopefully everybody can hear me. So this afternoon, as I mentioned, we'll be having a presentation from our Air Quality Planning and Science Division. So I will kick it over to Russell.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Russell Fury. I work for the off-road diesel analysis section. With me is Corey Palmer, my manager, but he's just going to be, but I'll be the one presenting. So should we wait a few minutes to get started?
I'm fine with that. If you're talking to me, I don't know. I was saying that sounds good to me if you're talking to me. I'm not sure.
Oh yeah, okay. We'll wait just a few more, couple minutes for people to arrive and attend, and then I can get started. Oops.
Hello, everyone. This is Corey. I'll just add in a couple of things. We're asked to remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded. It's just so you're aware if you ask questions. And two, I'll just mention to Russell, I think the attendee count is holding pretty steady. So I think everybody who's joining us is going to be here. That's it.
Okay, great. Well, then I'll get started. Okay, there we go. Perfect. So I'll be presenting information about the off-road or the in-use off-road inventory, and which is the information that's going into Nathan and Johanna's work towards a proposed regulation. So a brief overview of what equipment is going into this inventory. This is equipment that's over 25 horsepower, that's diesel powered and self-propelled. Obviously used in a wide variety of applications. It applies broadly to off-road equipment that are not already deemed agricultural, forestry, or cargo handling equipment. These pieces of equipment are required to report to Carb since 2007 and are subject to the in-use off-road regulation. Some of a quick overview of just the broad scope of what the inventory is. We're calculating emissions from the equipment that was outlined in the previous slide. At its core, the emissions inventory is based on the equation listed here in this slide. That is, the emissions of an engine equals the population, horsepower, activity, load factor, and emission factor are all multiplied. So with this, of course, the population is the population of the equipment in the state of California. The horsepower is the maximum horsepower of the equipment or the engine in the equipment. The the activity being the hours that the equipment is used per year, a load factor being the a unitless factor, a percentage of the full power of that engine used, and the emission factor being the emissions per brake horsepower hour from that piece of equipment. So this would be in units, grams per horsepower times hour. And we'll usually report that in a different value, say in tons per year, or just tons, or tons per day. So some of the updates to this inventory and to those values I mentioned just earlier would be the population of the inventory and the horsepower of those pieces of equipment. That information came from the DOORS reporting system. We used the calendar year 2020 for that data. The activity was updated with a voluntary survey that was within the DOORS database in 2020. Load factors are coming from the 2011 inventory. These have not really been updated at all, but just showing where they're coming from. There's the activity and a load balancing factor also being applied here, and I'll go into detail about this later, but it's coming from a 2021 EIA and Board of Equalization fuel reports. So we're balancing the fuel that the inventory is using to those fuel reports. And then lastly, the emission factors. These have been updated since the last in-use inventory. We've created new values in 2017 for off-road engines. Oh, excuse me. So going into the updated inputs, I'll first describe about the DOORS population, or the DOORS updates. So the population of the in-use inventory was updated with the DOORS database. We took the 2020 in-use equipment. So this was so the DOORS database includes a lot of information of previous years and ongoing equipment. So we've excluded previous excluded equipment that was retired before 2020 and those that were bought after 2020. So this is strictly just looking at the equipment that's in use in 2020. The main characteristics of the equipment that goes into and is used within the inventory are the type of equipment it is that's reported in the DOORS database, the fleet size, so wherever the fleet that owns that piece of equipment, what they are categorized as being small or medium or large within the current regulation. The horsepower group, also outlined in the previous regulation. I'll go into detail about that in a little bit, as well as the special designation groups. So that would be special categories like low use emergency equipment, 50% 99% ag equipment, and snow equipment. Next, I'll show you a pie chart of the distribution of the population within the different fleet size categories. So as you can see here, this is what we've reported as it being in 2020. The majority of the equipment is being owned by large fleets, followed by small, and then the smallest group group is the medium fleets. I thought also would be useful for everyone would be the distribution of equipment over the size, the horsepower bins. So I've outlined here the horsepower bins that are outlined in current regulation, and also by the fleet size. So in total, there's about 192,000 pieces of equipment out there, trending towards more the smaller half of the horsepower bin range, that being from 175 horsepower and smaller. Now to move on to the activity inputs. So we used we got information from a voluntary survey that was within the DOORS reporting system, or the DOORS users in mid-2020. So thank you to everyone who responded to that. We had received about 5,000. Sorry, let me say again. We received information about 5,000 vehicles in those responses. So we took that information and sorted it by age, equipment type, the equipment size, and the fleet size. Here, and in this slide, you can see the average activity rates by engine size and fleet size. So, however, in the this isn't the values used within the inventory. We do include the information about equipment type and age, but this is a useful graph to see what the distribution of activity is within the inventory. If we were to sort by age, there's a clear trend that the activity declines as the equipment ages. In this graph, this is showing the all the equipment by age, but again, this does not including it's not incorporate the fleet size, the equipment type, and horsepower bin. But the overall trend, as you can see, is that there's a clear decline, and so in each grouping of the activity, there is we show that decline in each grouping. This trend downwards of that they have less and less hours as they age, or as their model year gets older. The next input is the load factors. So currently in the inventory, the emission rate, or these load factors have not been updated and are the same values that we've used in the previous inventory, the 2011 inventory. However, the equipment types that are in use or in DOORS have expanded. So there's assumptions made to apply the previous values that were in the inventory to these new equipment types. And currently, Carb is performing new studies on load factors as well as emission factors, but which take into account duty cycle data. We plan to take these results of the studies and apply them to future inventories, but currently it's not in this inventory. So a final part of this activity information is this fuel balancing that I mentioned previously. So in this inventory, we're making sure that the fuel output or the fuel used that's outputted by the inventory matches reported fuel sold within the state. So we're getting information from the Energy Information Administration, or the EIA, which provides the off-road fuel sold, as well as the California Board of Equalization. They provide information on on-road fuel sold, but also reports the portion of that fuel that has tax credits applied for off-road use. So there's an additional off-road fuel, or what would be used by off-road in-use equipment in that reporting. So combining those two, we are balancing that to the off-road inventories. So which includes this one, as well as CHE, portable equipment, TRU equipment, logging equipment, as well as other smaller categories. And as you can see here, this is what the result of the balancing would be, I believe. Yeah. And this is the millions of gallons sold here. Or thousands, I'm sorry, excuse me, thousands of gallons. So taking that information as well as, excuse me, I missed a portion of what I want to discuss here. So for the in-use inventory, there's about to get the Carb inventory fuels to match the reported fuel used. There's about a 15% reduction or applied to the in-use inventory, and that is applied to the activity in this inventory. So using that information as well for the growth rates that we were going to use in this inventory. So the fuel growth, and maybe the most useful metric to determine the overall growth. And in this graph you're seeing here, this is showing the historic fuel sold. It slightly decreases over time, but up until about 2014, where there it stays relatively flat. So using this information, we are assuming a no growth scenario for this inventory. So we're making sure that the fuel is the fuel use is flat. And oh, excuse me, let me stay on this a little bit longer. So going on to a background of the off-road emission standards, that being the tier standards. They're split. These standards are split into tiers, which have increasingly stringent requirements on the NOx emission rates. So on a brake horsepower basis, the final tier 4 requirement is about 1/80th of the emission factors that are of a tier 0 piece of equipment. So the emission factors, as I mentioned before, were updated for this inventory. We have done work in 2017 to not only reflect the Tier 4 final certification data, but just overall certification data. So there was, as you can see here in this graph, the new factors are close to the previous values being in the blue, but are now reflecting testing as well as the use of credits by engine manufacturers in the compliance. So each level here is a different tier. I believe this is pre-tier, tier 0, tier 1, 2, 3, 4 initial, and then 4 final. And you can see that as the credit system doesn't lead to these sharp changes, but it's more of a gradual shift over to the new tier. Now I want to move on to the forecasting methodology. There are, I would want to say, forecasting in the in-use equipment can be effectively broken up into 2 portions, or for the sake of this inventory. Those 2 portions being natural turnover, that being the equipment that retires on its own and not through any regulatory means. And then there's a regulation check turnover, that being the equipment that retires due to the current in-use regulation or a check that we do in the inventory. How this is being applied is that the inventory calculates natural turnover first and then performs a check for the current regulation and applies a more turnover if needed. Oh, sorry, froze on me there for a second. So the forecasting requires modeling the age distribution of the equipment into future years. So a turnover curve is then needed, which is the average rate of vehicle turnover over time. We have made 3 turnover curves. These are based on the fleet size, so one for small fleets, one for medium fleets, and one for large fleets, and the equipment for those that are within those fleets. These curves are based off of the equipment distribution in the DOORS database. So the equipment that we use for population, we analyzed the age distribution and created these curves off of that. What this graph here is showing is the year-over-year change of the equipment normalized to 1. So say aged as aged 0 equipment ages. If we say there's say 10 pieces of age 0 equipment, as that is moved on in the inventory, as it ages within the inventory, these graphs would show the percent of that equipment that would be remaining in use. So what we found is that the small fleets have a relatively high amount of the age 0 to 3 equipment, but which turns over, it flattens out and stays steady up until about 13 years of age, and then retires or year over year after that. Medium fleets, the young equipment stays around for about 5 years, and then there's a natural decline. And then large, just year over year, has a more steady turnover. I'm gonna move on to the just an overview of the current regulation and how it functions, because this will be important in a couple slides. So the current regulation has a fleet average target and a fleet average index calculation that needs to be performed each year. A fleet should have their index meet the target to be in compliance. The target really is for a backed rate of 10% from 2020 onwards. There were values that are different beforehand, but since we're forecasting from 2020, that's what we're going to focus on today. This backed rate includes a combination of things, that being actual turnover of equipment, applying VDEX, and credit system. So if they returned over extra previous years, for example, you can accrue credits, and those can be applied to meet the backed rate. Okay. So the inventory handles this a little bit differently. We don't how the inventory does it is that we do a overall check, a fleet average target and a fleet average index of the overall fleet. So for the small, medium, the total small, total medium, and total large fleet. This is a purely a horsepower turnover check. This does not take into anything like credits or anything else. This is just a comparison of horsepower turnover. So if a fleet size overall does not meet the target, the turnover is potentially increased for that year, but and I'll go into detail on that in just a second, what that means. Because, however, the inventory has its own maximum turnover limit. This differs from the backed turnover, which, like I said before, is 10%. So the backed takes into account credits and VDEX, and it's very hard for us as on the inventory to forecast how those would be used. So we're just looking at purely just a horsepower turnover. And the assumption we're making here with this limit is that we're making the limit to maintain an average age of the equipment. So we're not trying to have each group turn over quickly. So as you can see here, this is what the horsepower turnover would be for the inventory. For our small fleets, it's a turnover of 6%. For medium fleets, it's 5%, and then
Russell, I think the screen share is mixing up.
Oh, my bad. Thank you. Sorry.
There we go.
Thank you for that, Corey.
Okay, looks good.
Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. So 6%, 5%, 10% is the maximum horsepower turnover. And here is the check that we have done to arrive at those maximum values. This, as you can see here, this is the average age of the groups of equipment over time. So 15. This is weighted by population here in the graph. So the small fleet is maintained at around a 13.5 year average age. The medium, a average age of about 11.5 years, and large, just about 7.5 to 8% average age for their equipment. Now going over the inputs and the discussion about the methodology a bit. I'll go over the emission results. So here's the final results of the emission inventory. This is grouped by tier. So this is, as you can see here, the tier 4 final is on top, and then tier 0 is on the bottom of this distribution here. In 2020, is about 55 tons per day of NOx, which reduces, which over time reduces, and about 2050 is about 11 tons per day, or 10. And as a comparison to the previous inventory from 2011, this is the results here. As you can see, it matches up fairly on the nose from 2020 up until 2025. But after that, deviates. So the previous inventory shows about a 21 tons per day in 2050, whereas this current inventory is showing about 10 tons per day of NOx in 2050. And then one last just overview of the results, the statewide results here. This is for just dividing up by fleet size. So small being the blue, medium being the red in the middle, and then large being on top. To go over a little discussion about the statewide reductions. So the statewide reductions are not being done by the inventory team at the moment. This is done by the reg team. They are estimating about 4 tons, or about 6.25 tons per day of NOx total in 2025, 6.2 in 2031, and then 4 tons per day in 2037. And to discuss about continued work, we're going to receive questions, or receive and respond to comments about the inventory, get feedback about what is going on in the inventory, continue to QA and look at the model output. So continue to refine what the inputs are. And well, if you wish for a copy of this presentation, please email me. And if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions after this workshop, please email me. My email is listed here. It's russell.fury@arb.ca.gov. And I want to open up the questions and comments. Please let me know if there's questions about what is happening in the inventory, and I can go back and forth between slides to facilitate the dialogue. So are there any questions typed in or hands raised?
There isn't any hands raised at this time.
Okay. I guess we'll wait for.
The questions that are typed are regarding the availability of the slides. Will these be posted soon? So, so Russell, I guess we'll have a space on our website that we will be posting them once after the workshop.
Yes, yes. So these, I'll let Corey comment on where they'll be posted, but I believe they will be posted after the workshop.
Yes, and I believe the recording will also be posted on the same place on our program website.
Yes. Corey, could you comment?
Sure. So if you go to the Carb mobile source emission inventory, there's a workshops and slides page, and it'll be posted there.
Okay.
Russell, would you mind showing your email address one more time on the screen?
Absolutely.
Okay, we have a question from Janet Wittick. If the statewide reductions were done by a different group, how were those estimates developed? I think I should answer that question. So while Russell and Corey's group worked on the baseline inventory that they presented on this time, the red group, specifically I worked on the reductions estimates. So using the baseline inventory, I did some, so we all did some analyses on which vehicles will be impacted, which vehicles will be phased out as a part of the requirements on the operational backstops, and also we assumed some emissions benefits based on the renewable diesel reductions in PM and NOx. So using the renewed baseline numbers that Russell provided us, that's where those numbers came from that you saw on that slide. Let me see if there are any other questions. Okay, there's a question from David Rothbart.
Mm-hmm.
Are fleet turnover assumptions impacted by the cost of replacement technologies? For example, if electric vehicles are substantially more costly, would that delay the turnover of the fleet?
So, assumptions. Currently, we are not looking at cost. We are just reflecting in the baseline the current reg and the just natural turnover. So cost calculations are usually done for the proposed reg. So if we were to apply a proposed regulation turnover, like increase of turnover for that, that would be performed with a cost analysis.
Yes, and of course that's regarding the baseline turnovers, and then of course the additional turnovers that the reg might require will be based on the specific vehicles that are being addressed by the operational bans, and also the assumption that Nathan mentioned in the first half of the presentation that we're assuming that Tier 4 finals are being used to replace most of the vehicles being turned over by the operational ban. for purposes of this numbers exercise for now, these preliminary numbers.
Yeah, and maybe I should also add too is that the turnover is done with the current knowledge, and there's not really any forecasting of how do I say, of changes in behavior of the fleets. So it's more of a business as usual type of calculation. So if there was a push for turning over to electric, we aren't reflecting that because of how it's just difficult to forecast that kind of behavior.
And I just wanted to mention that we will be doing a full cost analysis as part of the offered amendments.
Okay. So if that wraps it up for questions and comments for now, are there any more?
There are no more written questions for now, and I don't see any hands either.
Okay. Well then, if attendees watching at a later time have questions, my email is provided right here at russell.fury@arb.ca.gov. Feel free to email me with any questions you have, and also as well as if you want a copy of this this presentation immediately. And maybe I can just open it up to questions or comments for your team, or
Yeah, I can give a little. I'll give a little outro. But thank you, Russell, for that presentation. That was really helpful. Talk about the inventory. If anyone has any questions about anything we talked about today from the morning session, I think we got through all the questions, but I'll stall another minute just to see if there's any last minute questions in the chat or any hands raised. And if not, then we can adjourn for the day. Anything, any hands, any written questions?
Not this time.
Okay.
Okay, I think we're good then. Like Russell said, but same for our team. If you have any comments or questions for the amendments specifically, feel free to reach out to the ordamendments@arb.ca.gov email to reach out. And then, any questions on the inventory, as Russell mentioned, you can reach out to them. So thanks everybody for your participation, and looking forward to continuing work on these amendments.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, everyone. Oh, let's see.